The saloon went dead quiet when she walked in. Not the comfortable kind of quiet, the suffocating kind, where 50 people hold their breath at the same time because they all know something ugly is about to happen, and not a single one of them plans to stop it. She was 43 years old, wearing a dress that had been washed so many times the color had given up. She had a 12-year-old girl pressed close to her side, and she walked straight to the bar like she owned the place. Except everyone in Iron Creek knew she was about to lose the only thing she actually did own. Her name was Evelyn Harper, and she had exactly $11 to her name. If this kind of story moves you, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one's going to take a while. The first frost came early that year. It arrived the way bad news always does. Quietly, overnight, while everyone was sleeping and couldn't do a thing to stop it. By the time the sun came up over the eastern ridge, the grass along the creek beds had gone silver and stiff, and the old-timers in town were already shaking their heads and muttering to each other about what a hard winter was going to mean for the small ranches spread across the valley. Cole Maverick noticed the frost from his kitchen window at 5:30 in the morning. He stood there with a tin cup of black coffee going cold in his hand, watching the light hit the hillside, and he didn't say anything because there was nobody to say anything to. That was just the shape of his life now. Quiet mornings, cold coffee. A ranch that ran well enough but never felt quite like home, no matter how many years he'd been sleeping under its roof. He was 51 years old. He had a bad knee from a horse that had thrown him badly in his 30s, a face that had been weathered past its age by years of wind and sun, and hands so scarred and rough they barely felt like his own anymore. He wasn't a tall man, maybe 5'10" in his boots, but he carried himself in a way that made people step slightly to the side when he walked through a door. Not because he was frightening exactly, more because he gave off the impression of a man who had already seen most of what life had to throw at him, and had decided he wasn't going to flinch about it anymore. He'd come to Iron Creek 11 years ago with a wagon, a decent herd, and nothing else. No family, no explanation. He paid his bills on time, helped his neighbors when they asked, and otherwise kept entirely to himself. People in town had tried to pull his story out of him for years, and Cole had gotten very good at the particular skill of being friendly enough that folks didn't feel insulted while saying absolutely nothing of any real substance. The ranch he ran sat on about 400 acres of decent grazing land in the lower valley. Nothing spectacular, but solid ground that rewarded hard work. He had 22 head of cattle, a pair of reliable horses, and a barn that didn't leak, which put him ahead of a good number of his neighbors. He finished his cold coffee, set the cup in the dry sink, and went out to start his day. It was an ordinary Tuesday that cracked open in the middle. He'd been in town since around noon, picking up a sack of flour and some wire fencing from Henderson's general store, and he'd stopped into the Red Lantern Saloon around 2 o'clock, mostly because his knee was aching and he wanted to sit somewhere warm for a few minutes. He ordered a whiskey he didn't particularly want, found a table near the back wall out of habit, and watched the room without appearing to. The Red Lantern was Iron Creek's oldest and largest saloon, a long, low-ceilinged room with a bar along the left wall, a scattering of round tables in the middle, and a small stage at the far end that hosted fiddle players on Saturday nights. On a Tuesday afternoon, it was about half full, mostly ranchers and laborers taking a break from work, a few card games going quietly in the corners. Cole had been there maybe 20 minutes when the door swung open and let in a cut of cold air. He almost didn't look up, but then the noise in the room changed. Not louder, but different. That particular drop in volume that happens when something unexpected walks through the door. She came in straight-backed and deliberate, like she'd rehearsed the walk. Dark hair pinned up with a few strands coming loose at the sides. A face that might have been called handsome rather than pretty. Strong jaw, serious eyes, the kind of features that had been sharpened rather than softened by difficult years. She was wearing a dark blue dress that was clean and pressed but clearly old, and she had a young girl walking close at her left hip, dark-haired like her mother, watching the room with wide, careful eyes. The woman walked up to the bar. Jake Purdy, the bartender, looked up from the glass he was wiping. He was a heavy-set man with a red beard, generally good-natured, but right now his expression was doing something uncomfortable. Like he wanted to be polite, but also wanted whoever was at his bar to be somewhere else. "Mrs. Harper," he said. His voice was careful. "Can I help you? I need to speak to whoever's in charge of hiring. Her voice was clear and steady, but Cole, who had spent years listening to people the way some men listen for weather changes, could hear the very small tremor underneath it. Not weakness, more like a wire pulled so tight it was starting to vibrate. I can cook, I can clean, I can manage accounts. I did the books for my husband's operation for 12 years. I'm a hard worker, and I don't complain. Jake set his glass down slowly. Mrs. Harper, I appreciate you coming in, but I can work mornings, afternoons, or evenings. I'll take whatever hours you can give me. I don't need much, just enough to... Evelyn, a man's voice from one of the tables, blunt and unpleasant. There's no work here for you. Cole turned his head slightly. The voice belonged to Ted Gruber, a cattle broker who operated out of the valley, a wide, loud man who had money and used it the way some men use size. He was sitting at a table with two other men Cole didn't recognize. The whole town knows your situation, Gruber continued, not bothering to lower his voice. Ranch is nearly gone. Cattle herd's down to nothing. You're 3 months behind on your payments to Aldrich's bank. What are you going to do, work at a saloon until the foreclosure notice comes? He said it almost kindly, which made it worse. Go home, Evelyn. Make arrangements for your daughter. That's the sensible thing. The room was completely still now. The girl at Evelyn's side had gone rigid. She was staring at Gruber with an expression that was half fear and half something much older and angrier than a 12-year-old should have had to develop yet. Evelyn Harper did not look at Gruber. She looked at Jake Purdy. And Cole watched the composure in her face do that thing composure does when it's being held up by sheer stubbornness, rigid on the surface, cracking underneath. Do you have work or don't you? She said. Not a question. More like the last round in the chamber. Jake opened his mouth, closed it. I'm sorry, Mrs. Harper, I don't. She stood there for one more second. Then she nodded once, precisely, as if she were agreeing with something she already knew, and turned to leave. That was the moment Cole stood up. He wasn't entirely sure why. He'd told himself for years that other people's business was other people's business, and he'd kept that promise well enough. But something about the way she turned, spine still straight, chin still up, like she was walking out with dignity, even though the room had just watched her get cut down. Something about that moved in his chest like a splinter he hadn't known was there. Mrs. Harper. His voice carried through the room without him meaning it to. Everything turned toward him. Evelyn stopped walking, turned. He crossed the room toward her, stepping around a table, his knee complaining on the third step the way it always did. He was aware of every eye in the saloon tracking him. He was also aware that he didn't have a clear plan for what came next. He stopped in front of her. Up close, she was more tired than he'd realized. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of weeks rather than days, and one of her hands, she was holding her daughter's shoulder, had knuckles that were red and dry from work. She was looking at him with an expression that was not quite hope, because she'd already taken that out and put it somewhere safe, but was maybe the space where hope had been. My name is Cole Maverick, he said. I run a spread about 8 miles south of town, Lower Valley, near the creek bend. I know who you are, she said. Her voice was measured, not unfriendly, just not giving anything away. My ranch hand quit on me 3 weeks ago, went up to Wyoming. He paused. I've been looking for someone who can manage the books, keep track of inventory, organize the supply orders. It's not glamorous work, mostly ledgers and correspondence. I'd need somebody a few days a week. The girl at Evelyn's side was looking up at Cole with an expression that was somewhere between hope and suspicion, a child who'd already learned that things that sounded good often weren't. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Cole could see her working through it, the pride of it, the necessity of it, the question of what this man actually wanted. What would the pay be? She asked. $1.50 a day when you come in. I'd need you Tuesdays and Thursdays to start, maybe Saturdays during busy season. Her jaw tightened slightly. He could see her doing the arithmetic. And what would you need from me, beyond the ledgers? Nothing beyond the ledgers, he said. Flat and clear, because he understood what she was asking and wanted her to understand his answer. Someone at one of the tables, he thought it was Gruber but didn't look, made a small derisive sound. Evelyn looked at Cole for another long moment. He didn't fidget. He just stood there and let her look. I'll need to bring my daughter on the days I can't find anyone to watch her, she said. That's fine. I'll start Thursday. Thursday works. She nodded once. The same precise nod she'd given Jake Purdy, but this time it meant something different. Then she took her daughter's hand and walked out of the red lantern, and the cold air came in again for a second as the door swung shut behind her. Cole turned back toward the room. Every face was watching him with varying levels of confusion, amusement, or judgment. Ted Gruber was shaking his head slowly with the expression of a man watching someone do something he'd regret. Cole went back to his table, picked up his whiskey, finished it. He sat there another minute and then realized his cold coffee had been better than the whiskey anyway and went to pay his bill. Thursday came in gray and cold with a wind off the mountains that had teeth in it. Cole was in the barn at 7 in the morning repairing a section of fence rail that had split over the summer when he heard horses on the road. He set his tools down and came to the barn door and watched Evelyn Harper ride in on a brown mare that was older than it should have been working this kind of weather. She was riding alone, no daughter today. She swung down from the horse with the ease of someone who'd been doing it since before they could remember, tied the mare to the post by the water trough, and walked toward the barn door with a worn leather satchel over one shoulder. "Mrs. Harper," Cole said. "Mr. Maverick." She looked at the barn, then at the house. "Where do you want me to work?" "Kitchen table's got the most light, stove's already going." He paused. "Coffee's on too, if you want it." "I'd be grateful for that." He led her inside. The house was what it was, a working man's house, functional and sparse. The furniture was solid but mismatched. There was a rack of tools by the back door and a pair of muddy boots in the corner that he'd forgotten to put away. He noticed these things more acutely than usual, seeing the room through someone else's eyes. He'd laid the ledgers and paperwork out on the kitchen table before she arrived. 3 years of accounts, supply records, and correspondence with buyers in Denver and Pueblo. It was all roughly organized, but only roughly. He was better at running cattle than running numbers. She sat down at the table, set her satchel aside, and looked at the stacks of paper with an expression that he couldn't quite read. Then she poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove, sat back down, and started going through the ledgers from the oldest forward. She didn't say much for the first hour. Cole went back out to finish the fence rail. When he came in at mid-morning to warm his hands, she had already reorganized the papers into a system that made considerably more sense than what he'd given her, and she was writing in a clean hand in a fresh ledger she'd apparently brought with her. "You're missing about $40 in accounts receivable from the fall of '81, she said without looking up. "Harlan Brothers in Pueblo. Did they ever settle that?" Cole stopped pulling off his gloves. "I don't know. I thought they did. I don't see a record of it." She tapped the page. "I'll write them and ask." "You don't have to. It's $40. And it's my job." She looked up. "Unless you'd rather I leave it." He thought about it for a second. "No. Write them." She went back to the ledger. He poured himself coffee and stood at the window for a moment, watching the sky. "Your daughter doing all right today?" A pause in the writing, small but there. "She's with a neighbor. She's fine." Another pause. "She doesn't like staying behind." "How old?" 12? She'll be 13 in February." Something softened slightly in Evelyn's voice when she talked about the girl, like a joint that worked better when it was warm. "Her name is Clara. Smart kid. I could see that." Evelyn looked up at him, and for just a moment, something almost like gratitude moved across her face before she folded it back. "She is. Too smart for her own good sometimes." She said it like a woman who was proud of something that also cost her. Cole set his cup down. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything." It was on her third visit, a cold Saturday morning 2 weeks in, that things shifted. She'd been working through his correspondence, writing replies and organizing his buyer contacts, and he'd come in for the midday meal to find her staring at a piece of paper with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Still. Very, very still. The kind of stillness that isn't calm at all, but the thing that sits just before something breaks. Clara was with her that day, sitting at the far end of the table doing schoolwork from a battered primer she'd brought in her mother's bag. The girl looked up when Cole came in, and her eyes went immediately to her mother, and something in Clara's expression told Cole this was not the first time she'd seen that look. "Mrs. Harper." Evelyn set the paper face down on the table. Methodical, controlled. "I'm sorry. I'll finish the Harlan letter this afternoon. I just needed a moment." What is it? It wasn't a question. She looked at him for a second, and he could see her deciding whether to answer. She turned the paper back over and slid it toward him across the table. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, picking up the letter. It was from the First National Bank of Iron Creek. He read it twice. The letter informed Mrs. Evelyn Harper that her outstanding debt of $3,200, the mortgage taken on her property by her late husband, Robert Harper, in April of 1881, had been reviewed by the bank's new director of operations. Given the current valuation of the property, the declining productivity of the cattle operation, and the missed payments of the preceding 3 months, the bank was formally notifying her that unless significant progress toward repayment could be demonstrated within 60 days, the bank reserved the right to initiate foreclosure proceedings on the Harper Ranch property and all associated assets. Signed by one Arthur J. Aldrich, director. Cole set the letter down. Clara had gone very quiet at the other end of the table, her primer closed now in her lap. 60 days, he said. 60 days. Evelyn's voice was even. It was doing that vibrating wire thing again. The loan was structured with a long repayment schedule. My husband negotiated it that way specifically. He had a plan. It was supposed to take us through the lean years and give us time to rebuild the herd. She stopped, pressed her lips together. Robert died 18 months ago. The cattle have been sick. We lost nearly a third of the herd to fever last spring. The land needs work I couldn't afford to pay for. She looked down at the table. I've been making partial payments when I could. I thought Aldrich understood the situation. I thought we had time. Who's Aldrich? He came in about 8 months ago, took over from Montgomery. Something hard moved across her expression. Montgomery was a fair man. Aldrich is... She stopped herself, looked at Clara, then back at the letter. He's different. Cole looked at the number again. $3,200 was a serious amount of money, more than most ranchers in the lower valley held in cash at any given time. What's the ranch worth? He asked. The land alone is worth considerably more than the debt. That's the problem. Her voice went flat. If the bank forecloses, they can sell it well above what I owe them and pocket the difference. And you've got what on hand right now? She was quiet. Mrs. Harper. $11, she said. The words were very quiet. $11.40. Clara was staring at her schoolbook. Her jaw was set exactly the way her mother's jaw set, and it struck Cole, not pleasantly. The 12 years old was a hard age to be learning that the adults in your life might not be able to fix things. Cole sat with the letter for another minute. Then he folded it carefully, slid it back across the table toward Evelyn, and stood up. I'll start a meal, he said. Clara, are you hungry? The girl looked up, surprised to be addressed. She glanced at her mother. Yes, sir, she said. Good. He went to the stove. Finish your reading while I get something on. He lay awake that night for a long time. The ranch was dark and quiet around him, the kind of quiet that sits on the open land differently than it sits in a town, deeper and more absolute. He listened to the wind work around the eaves and looked at the ceiling and thought about $3,200 and a woman who had $11.40 and a daughter whose jaw had the same angle of stubbornness as her mother's. He thought about Arthur Aldrich, whom he'd seen twice in town, a compact, precise man in his mid-50s with a banker's hands, and the kind of eyes that assessed everything in terms of what it cost and what it could be sold for. He thought about the timing of the letter, the 60-day window, the foreclosure clause. He thought about what Evelyn had said, that the land was worth more than the debt. And he thought about a ranch he'd driven past a few times in the last year out in the Eastern Valley. Harper Ranch. Not impressive from the road. Fences needed work, the outbuildings were weathered, but the land itself was something else. Wide and well-watered, with a good creek through the lower pasture and hills that would shelter a herd in a bad winter. He'd noticed it. You couldn't help noticing it if you knew land. He thought about the savings he'd been building for 11 years. Sitting in the Iron Creek Bank in a separate account. His own account, not Aldrich's bank. He was particular about that. Money he'd accumulated slowly through careful work and careful living, with a vague idea that he'd use it someday to expand his own herd or buy out a neighboring property if the right one came up. He thought about his wife, who had been dead for 9 years, and his son, who had been dead for 7, and how he'd spent the years since then building something that looked like a life from the outside without much considering what he was actually building it for. He stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then he got up, lit the lamp, and sat at the small desk in the corner of his bedroom where he kept his own accounts. He opened the ledger, looked at the number he already knew was there, $4,820. He sat with that number for a while. Then he closed the ledger, blew out the lamp, and went back to bed. He didn't sleep well, but by the time morning came gray over the ridge, he'd made up his mind. He came to her ranch on Sunday. He'd thought about sending a note first, but decided a note would give her time to refuse before he'd actually said anything, and he wanted to say it in person. So he rode the 8 miles out on his bay gelding, crossed the lower valley, and followed the road up toward the Harper place. He'd been right about the land. Even in October, with everything going brown and the grass flattened by the frost, you could see the quality of it. The creek that ran through the lower pasture was clear and running strong. The hillside behind the main house caught the south light in a way that would mean good grazing into late November. The house itself was a solid 2-story structure that needed paint but had good bones. Someone had built it carefully, with the intention of it lasting. The fences were in poor shape. He counted at least 4 sections that needed repair just from the road. The gate at the entrance was hanging crooked on its hinges. He rode up to the house and dismounted, tied his horse to the porch rail, and knocked. Clara answered the door. She was wearing a worn work dress and had a smear of something, flour, maybe, on her cheek, and she looked at Cole with the same careful expression she'd had in the saloon. "Mr. Maverick," she said. "Miss Clara, is your mother home?" "She's in the barn." A pause. "She's been out there since before breakfast." He thanked her and walked around the side of the house to the barn. The door was partially open and he could hear movement inside. The sound of someone working, rhythmic and purposeful. Evelyn was inside, mucking out one of the horse stalls. She was in work clothes, trousers and a heavy coat, her hair braided back, and she was working with the mechanical focus of someone who uses labor the way other people use whiskey. She heard him come in and straightened, turning. Whatever she'd expected on a Sunday morning, it wasn't him. Her expression shifted through several things quickly. "Mr. Maverick." She leaned the pitchfork against the stall wall. "Is something wrong?" "No. I need to talk to you about something." He looked around the barn. There were 2 horses, both older, and a half-empty hayloft. The barn was clean but spare. "Can we sit somewhere?" She studied him for a moment. Then she came out of the stall, brushed her hands on her coat, and walked to the low bench along the far wall. She sat. He sat at the other end, leaving a proper distance between them. He took his hat off, held it in both hands, looked at her. "I want to help you," he said. "With the debt." The silence went very flat. "No," she said. The word came out immediately, no hesitation. "I haven't explained it." "You don't need to. The answer is no." She looked at the wall of the barn. Her jaw was tight. "I appreciate what you've done already, Mr. Maverick. The work is helpful, and I'm grateful for it, but I'm not going to take charity from— It's not charity." He let that land. Waited. "I want to make a business arrangement." She turned and looked at him directly, waiting. "You've seen my books," he said. "My operation is running well, but it's limited. I've got good land, but I can't expand what I've got without more acreage, and buying additional land in this valley at current prices doesn't make sense." He paused. "Your land does make sense. The creek access, the southern exposure on the upper pasture. That's what I've been trying to find a way to add to my operation for years." She was still watching him, not saying anything. "I'm proposing a partnership. I put in the money to clear the debt, all of it, or enough to get Aldrich off your back for now. In exchange, I get a stake in the ranch. Say, 40%. We run it jointly. Combine some of the operations where it makes sense, keep books together, make decisions together." He paused. "You keep your home, you keep your majority. Your name stays on the deed. You'd invest that kind of money," she said slowly, "into someone else's failing ranch. Into a ranch with good land that's failing for reasons that can be fixed. There's a difference." Her expression was hard to read, somewhere between calculation and something more complicated. "Why?" she said. "Because it's a good investment. That's not the only reason." He thought about lying, or deflecting, or saying something that was technically true without being fully honest. Then he thought about the way she'd turned to leave the Red Lantern and how her spine had still been straight, and he decided she deserved a straight answer. Because watching someone get pushed off good land because a banker wants to steal it bothers me. Because your daughter was sitting at my table doing her schoolwork with her jaw set like she was daring the world to try something, and that kind of kid deserves better than what's about to happen to her family. He looked down at his hat. And because I've been sitting on money I don't have a particular purpose for, and I'm 51 years old, and I'd rather it did something than just sat there. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. The horses shifted in their stalls. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches of the cottonwood trees that lined the fence. You'd want legal papers, she said finally. Yes. I'd want to talk to a lawyer. That's reasonable. And I want it understood, she said, that this is a business arrangement, nothing more. That's what I'm offering, he said. Nothing more. She looked at him for another long moment. Cole sat still and let her look. Give me a week, she said. I need to think about it. Take what you need. He put his hat back on, stood up, and thanked her. He walked back through the barn to the door, and he was almost outside when her voice came after him. Mr. Maverick. He turned. She was standing in the middle of the barn, arms crossed, with the look of a woman in the middle of making a decision that she already knew she was going to have to live with for a long time. Why didn't you ask me in the saloon, she said, when all those people were watching? Because it wasn't their business, he said, and because it would have felt like charity if I'd done it there. He paused. This is a business conversation. It needed to happen somewhere private. She held his gaze for another second. Then she nodded. Once. He walked back to his horse and rode home through the cold afternoon, and he didn't let himself think about whether she'd say yes until she actually did. She sent a note on Thursday. It came with Clara, who rode over on the old brown mare with a folded paper tucked inside her coat. Cole was working the fence line on the north pasture when he saw the girl coming up the road, and he walked down to meet her. Clara pulled up and handed the note over with a serious expression. Mama said to give you this. Cole opened it. It was short. Mr. Maverick, I've spoken to Mr. Reeves. He says the arrangement is legally sound and can be documented properly. If your offer still stands, I'll accept it on the terms we discussed. Please let me know when you'd like to proceed. E. Harper. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket. Tell your mother, he said to Clara, that the offer still stands, and I'll come by Monday morning to ride into town together and see Reeves. Clara looked at him steadily. She had her mother's eyes, he noticed, the same dark brown, the same quality of paying attention. Mr. Maverick, she said, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why are you doing this? She said it the same way her mother had. Direct, no decoration. Cole looked at the girl for a moment. She was 12 years old and riding alone 8 miles in October cold to deliver her mother's business correspondence. And she was asking him the kind of question that most adults danced around. Because your land is worth saving, he said, and because I can help, so I should. Clara considered this with the gravity of someone taking an answer seriously. Then she nodded, that precise single nod, the one he'd seen her mother do, and turned the mare around and headed back down the road. Cole watched her go for a minute. Then he went back to the fence. The meeting with Reeves, Walter Reeves, Iron Creek's only attorney, who operated out of a cluttered office above the general store, took most of Monday morning. Reeves was a thin man in his 60s with a meticulous mustache and the careful manner of someone who had seen too many handshake agreements go badly. He read the proposed terms twice, asked Cole 4 questions, asked Evelyn 7, and then produced a partnership agreement that was 18 pages long and covered every contingency he could think of. They signed it that afternoon. Reeves witnessed both signatures and kept a copy in his files. Walking out of Reeves's office and into the cold afternoon street, the reality of what had just happened settled around Cole with a particular weight. He'd put 40% of his savings into someone else's operation. He had a legal partnership with a woman he'd known for 2 weeks. Beside him, Evelyn tucked her copy of the agreement into her satchel. She didn't look at him immediately. First order of business, she said. We need to go to the bank. Yes. I'd prefer to go alone. She finally looked at him. To Aldrich. Cole thought about arguing, decided against it. You're sure? I'm sure. Something moved in her face. Not anger exactly, but the cousin of it. He wrote that letter to me. I want to deliver the response myself. He thought about what it would feel like, after the letter she'd gotten, to walk into Aldrich's bank and put the money on his desk. He understood. "I'll be at Henderson's if you need me," he said. She nodded and walked across the street toward the First National Bank with her spine straight and her satchel over her shoulder. And Cole watched her go and thought about the shape of courage in ordinary things. She was out of the bank in 20 minutes. She came across the street to Henderson's with a flat expression that didn't give him much to read. He was standing at the counter pretending to look at a display of harness fittings when she walked in. "Well?" he said. He took the payment. Her voice was precise. He said... She stopped, pressed her lips together. He said he was glad we had found a solution and that he hoped we'd be able to maintain the payments going forward. A pause. Then he smiled. And I thanked him and left. She looked at the harness fittings without seeing them. He has a way of smiling that makes you understand that this isn't over as far as he's concerned. Cole set down the piece of harness he'd been holding. "No," he said. "It probably isn't." They stood there for a moment in the warm, cluttered interior of Henderson's general store, with the smell of leather and grain and cold air from the door. And Cole thought about Aldrich's smile and what it meant for the 60 days ahead. "We need to work fast," he said. "I know." She looked at him. "The fences first. If we can get them solid before the hard freeze, we can bring the remaining cattle in from the upper pasture and move them to the creek meadow where the grazing is better. Then we need to talk about the herd. What we have, what we need, what's realistically possible before spring. I've got good cattle. We can look at running some of them on your upper pasture next season once the fencing is right. That would help." She was talking practically, efficiently, the way she'd worked through his ledgers. "The water problem on the south end of the property needs to be addressed. There's a spring that used to feed a stock pond, but it got blocked up. Robert meant to clear it, but..." She stopped. That particular kind of silence. It never got done. "I can take a look at it." "I can take a look at it. I know where it is." He almost smiled, caught it before it arrived. "You can take a look at it." She met his eyes. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile either, but something adjacent to it. It was gone immediately. "We should get back," she said. Claire's been alone all morning." They walked out into the cold afternoon and the sky was going silver in the west. And Iron Creek moved around them in its ordinary small-town way, and neither of them said anything else until they reached their horses and rode out in different directions. The work began in earnest that week. Cole brought 2 hired hands from his own ranch, men he trusted, brothers named Dutch, and Pete, who could build fence as fast and clean as anyone he'd ever seen, and they started on the Harper fencing from the northeast corner and worked their way around. Evelyn was out with them every morning, moving post sections, checking line, driving staples. She didn't stand aside and watch. She worked, and she worked hard, and after the second day, Dutch said to Cole privately that she worked as well as most of the men he'd hired, which was about as high a compliment as Dutch gave anyone. Clara was in and out. She had school in the mornings. Evelyn was particular about that. The school work didn't stop for fencing. But in the afternoons, she appeared in work gloves and her father's old coat and made herself useful in whatever way she could find. She had a real affinity for the horses. Cole noticed she spent more time with them than she needed to, talking to them quietly in a way that wasn't silly, but was the kind of conversation that a person has when they want company that doesn't ask too much from them. He and Evelyn developed a working rhythm over those first weeks that was mostly practical and efficient and occasionally slightly prickly, because they were 2 stubborn people who sometimes had different ideas about how to do things. The first real disagreement was about the cattle, specifically about which of Evelyn's remaining herd to sell and which to keep through winter. She wanted to keep a certain older cow that Cole thought was past productive years and would be a drain on winter feed. She disagreed with some heat. "Her calf from last spring is one of the best we have," she said. They were in the barn, and she was pointing at the cow in question. "She's got good bloodlines, and she passes them on. You sell her, you lose that going forward. She's 9 years old. She might not give you another season. She might give me 3 more seasons if she winters well, and in this herd I cannot afford to lose the bloodlines." Her eyes were sharp. "You know cattle, Mr. Maverick, but I know this cattle. There's a difference." Cole looked at the cow. He looked at Evelyn. He thought about the fact that she'd been managing this herd since her husband died, and that she'd managed to keep it from complete collapse under conditions that would have broken most people. "We keep the cow," he said. Evelyn blinked. He got the impression she'd been prepared for more of a fight. "The next disagreement," he said. "I might not fold so quickly." "I don't expect you to," she said. And this time the corner of her mouth actually did move, and she turned away before he could see whether it became anything more. It was in those weeks of work, real, dirty, exhausting, daily work, that Cole began to understand what had happened to the Harper Ranch and what it had cost the woman running it. The story came out slowly, not in one conversation, but in pieces. Something mentioned over a shared lunch on the tailgate of the wagon, something said while they were both watching the sunset from the porch steps and too tired to make conversation about anything important. He learned that Robert Harper had been a decent man and a decent rancher who had perhaps been too optimistic about what the land could produce in bad years, and had taken the bank loan based on projections that required everything going right. He died of a fever in March of '82, leaving Evelyn with the debt, a depleted herd, 2 sections of fence that needed immediate replacement, and a daughter who was 11 years old. She'd spent the 18 months since doing the work of 2 people on limited sleep and a budget that didn't allow for mistakes. The cattle fever in the spring had hit her already. Weakened herd harder than most because she hadn't had the money to bring in a vet until it was late. She'd lost 11 head in 3 weeks. "I thought I could make it," she said one evening, not looking at him, looking at the hillside where the last of the light was going orange. "I thought if I could just get through one more season, just get the herd back to a working size, I could start getting ahead of the debt." "You almost did," Cole said. She was quiet for a moment. Aldrich didn't give me the chance to almost. He understood what she was saying. The timing of the letter, not when she was hopelessly behind, but just as she was beginning to show signs of recovery, that timing had a specific shape to it. "He's done this before," Cole said. It wasn't a question. 3 ranches in this valley in the last 2 years, she said. Her voice had gone hard and quiet. The Drummond place, the Sutter property, a small homestead on the North Ridge that belonged to a young family. I can't remember their name. She paused. All of them had loans with the First National. All of them went to foreclosure within Aldrich's first year as director. All of them sold at auction for considerably less than the land was worth, and the bank held the winning bid on all 3. Cole turned this over. "He's buying the land. The bank is, which means Aldrich or whoever's behind him is." She finally looked at Cole. "Robert knew something was wrong before he died. He tried to get people to pay attention. Nobody wanted to." She looked back at the hillside. "Nobody likes looking at the water when they're afraid to swim." Cole sat with this for a minute. The wind was cold and smelled like snow coming. "It would take more than us to stop him in the long run," he said carefully. "One ranch paying off its debt doesn't change the pattern." "I know." Her voice was even. "But one ranch is what I have, and I intend to keep it." She stood up, brushed off her coat, and went inside. Cole sat on the step alone for a few minutes longer, watching the last of the light leave the hillside, thinking about Arthur Aldrich's smile and what it meant for all of them. The first snow came in November. Not a killing storm, 6 inches gone in 4 days, but enough to confirm that winter was on its way and that they were behind on preparations. They pushed harder. Cole started arriving at the Harper Ranch by 7 most mornings and rarely left before dark. The work was physical and relentless: feed storage, fence repair, water system, the stock pond that Evelyn had mentioned. The block spring turned out to be a significant undertaking. 2 days of digging to clear the channel, then a stone and timber work to keep it clear. But when the water finally ran through into the pond again and the cattle moved down to drink, Evelyn stood at the edge of the pasture watching them and said nothing for a full minute. "Robert dug that spring channel," she said finally, quietly. Cole didn't say anything. "He spent 3 weeks on it. Year we first came here." She was still watching the cattle. "Said it was going to be the making of the ranch." Cole looked at the pond, at the cattle, at the clear water catching the flat winter light. "He was right," he said. She nodded once. Then she turned and walked back up toward the barn without another word, and Cole watched her go and understood that there were rooms in her grief that were still full of things she hadn't touched yet, and that was nobody's business but her own. Clara found him one afternoon in December when Evelyn had gone into town for supplies. Cole was working on the tack room, reorganizing the bridles and replacing some worn leather, when the girl appeared in the doorway. She leaned against the frame with her arms crossed the way her mother stood, watching him work. "Mr. Maverick," she said. "Clara, can I ask you something?" "You're going to anyway," he said without unkindness. She almost smiled. "Are you going to stay?" He set down the bridle he was working on and looked at her. She was asking it straight, the way she asked everything. No decoration, no pretense. "I have a partnership in this ranch," he said. "So yes." "That's not what I meant." Her dark eyes were steady on him. "I mean, are you going to stay the way you've been here, working every day, like you're part of it?" Cole was quiet for a moment. He thought about the fence he'd repaired, the spring channel he'd dug out, the early mornings and the late evenings, and the way the ranch had started to look different over the past 2 months. Not perfect, not fixed, but alive in a way it hadn't looked when he'd ridden up that first Sunday. "I expect so," he said. "If your mother's agreeable." Clara considered this. "She doesn't say much," she said, "about anything. She keeps it all inside and then she gets up and works." "I noticed." "I just thought you should know." Clara uncrossed her arms and pushed off the doorframe. "That she notices things even when she doesn't say them. She told Mrs. Caldwell that you were a decent man. She wouldn't say that if she didn't mean it." Then she left, with the quick light step of a 12-year-old who had said what she'd come to say and was now done with it. Cole sat with the bridle in his hands for a long moment. Outside, the winter light was thinning toward afternoon, and somewhere on the property, cattle were moving through the creek meadow, and the fence lines he'd helped rebuild were standing clean and solid against the cold sky. He picked up the bridle and went back to work. What? There are debts that can be measured in dollars, and then there are the other kinds, the ones that live in a person's chest and don't come with repayment schedules. In the first weeks of that winter partnership, Cole Maverick began to understand which kind was harder to settle, and who among them was carrying the heaviest load. And 50 miles away in the warmth of the First National Bank, Arthur Aldrich sat at his desk and looked at the paid account of Evelyn Harper and thought about 60 days and what a person could do to a ranch and a woman in 60 days if they were patient enough and willing enough to wait. December settled over the lower valley like a hand pressing down. The cold wasn't dramatic about it. No blizzards, no killing storms in those first weeks. Just a steady, patient cold that worked its way into everything. Into the ground, into the barn walls, into the joints of a 51-year-old man who'd been spending 12-hour days outside since October. Cole's knee had stopped just aching and started making a grinding noise that he tried not to think about too carefully. The work didn't stop for Cole. If anything, it accelerated because both he and Evelyn understood, without discussing it directly, that Aldrich's 60-day window had become 45 days, and then 30, and that paying off the existing debt had bought them time but hadn't bought them safety. The bank still held the mortgage. The payments still had to come. And Arthur Aldrich was still sitting in his office on Main Street, looking at accounts with the particular patience of a man who has decided to wait something out. Cole had started keeping a second set of records. Not because Evelyn's bookkeeping was inadequate. Hers was better than his. But because he wanted a separate accounting of where the partnership stood, what money was moving, what the ranch was actually producing versus what it needed to produce. He sat with those numbers every Sunday evening at his kitchen table, and most Sunday evenings the numbers told him the same uncomfortable truth. They were making progress, but progress in ranching moved the way a glacier moved. You had to measure it in seasons, not weeks, and the debt didn't care about seasons. It was on a Sunday evening in mid-December that he finally added up the full picture and saw what he'd been avoiding seeing. Between the partnership investment, the operating costs of running 2 ranches through winter, and the upcoming spring expenses, new cattle to rebuild the Harper herd, feed, vet bills, supplies, he was looking at a stretch that would thin his remaining savings down to almost nothing. Not nothing, but close enough to nothing that one bad event, a sick herd, a broken well, a hard frost at the wrong time, could tip them over. He sat with that number for a while. Then he closed the ledger and went to bed, because there was nothing useful that worrying about it at 10 o'clock on a Sunday was going to accomplish. The next morning he rode to the Harper Ranch and found Evelyn already in the south pasture, checking on the cattle they'd moved to the creek meadow. She had a bucket of feed supplement in one hand and was moving between the animals with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who'd grown up doing it. Cole tied his horse and walked down to meet her, and they fell into step together along the fence line the way they'd been doing for 2 months now. Naturally, without planning it, the way two people develop a rhythm when they spend enough hours working the same ground. "I did the combined accounts last night," he said. She looked at him sideways. "And? We're not broke, but we're thinner than I'd like." "How thin?" "If the spring calving goes well and we can move 20 head to market by June, we're fine. If something goes wrong—" He paused. "We'd need to be careful." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, breaking off a piece of feed supplement and holding it out to a heifer that had come nosing over. The animal took it with a rough tongue. "I know," she said. "I've been doing the same math." "You didn't say anything." "Neither did you." She looked at him. "Until now." He acknowledged this with a slight tilt of his head. "Dutch thinks the upper pasture could support another 15 head if we clear the scrub on the eastern slope. That'd be a spring project, but it would give us considerably more grazing room. The scrub clearing would take 2 weeks and cost money we don't have in the short term." "I know, I'm looking at whether I can sell some timber off my north ridge. There's a stand of pine up there that a mill in Pueblo has been interested in for 2 years. That might cover it." Evelyn turned this over. She had the habit, he'd noticed, of thinking before she spoke, not hesitating, but genuinely turning a thing over before she committed to an opinion on it. He'd started to appreciate this, because he'd also been around people who said whatever came to them first and then had to walk it back, and the latter was considerably more exhausting. "Talk to the mill," she said, "but don't sell below what the timber's worth, and find out if Aldrich has any connection to the Pueblo mill before you do." Cole stopped walking, looked at her. "You think he reaches that far?" "I think a man who systematically picks off small ranches using their bank debt as a tool doesn't limit his reach to what's visible." She said it evenly, not with dramatics. "Robert thought Aldrich operated alone. He didn't look hard enough at who else was in the picture." She paused. "I've been looking." He stood there in the cold pasture with the cattle moving around them and looked at this woman who had been managing her grief and her ranch and her daughter and her debt, and apparently also conducting her own investigation into a corrupt banker, and felt something move in his chest that he didn't examine too closely. "What have you found?" he said. "Not enough. Yet." She picked up the empty bucket and turned back toward the barn. "Come inside. I'll show you what I have." What she had was a collection of documents spread across the kitchen table. Letters, deed records she'd obtained from the county office, newspaper clippings from the regional paper. Clara was at school, so the house was quiet, and Evelyn laid the papers out with the same methodical clarity she brought to the ranch accounts. The 3 foreclosures she'd mentioned, Drummond, Sutter, the homestead on the North Ridge, had all followed the same pattern. A loan in arrears, a deadline imposed significantly earlier than the original loan terms allowed, a foreclosure auction that moved quickly and quietly, with the bank itself or a holding company connected to the bank appearing as the buyer. In the case of the Sutter property, the transaction had been completed in 11 days from the foreclosure auction to the transfer of deed, an unusually short time that suggested the buyer had already known they were buying before the auction happened. "The holding company," Evelyn said, pointing to a letterhead she'd obtained through connections Cole didn't ask about. "Meridian Land Holdings, incorporated in Denver 8 months before Aldrich took over at the First National." Cole looked at the letterhead, then at Evelyn. "Aldrich incorporated it. I can't prove that directly, but the timing is suggestive. Very." She straightened. "What I can't find is who else is involved. Aldrich isn't rich enough to do this on his own. Someone is backing him." Cole looked at the papers. He thought about Ted Gruber, who'd been in the saloon the day Evelyn walked in, who'd spoken with the casual certainty of a man who already knew how things were going to turn out. He thought about Gruber's cattle brokerage, how it operated out of the valley, how he'd seen Gruber's wagon parked outside the First National more than once. "Gruber," he said. Evelyn looked at him. Something shifted in her face. Not surprise exactly, but the look of someone having a suspicion confirmed by an outside source. "I've thought about Gruber," she said carefully. "He was too comfortable that day in the saloon, like he already knew the ending. He's been in this valley for 12 years. He knows which ranches are struggling and which aren't. He'd know which land is worth acquiring. She paused. And cattle brokers talk to bankers. They looked at each other across the table and the spread of papers. And the kitchen was cold because the stove had burned low, and outside the wind was moving through the bare cottonwoods. Even if we're right, Cole said, knowing it and proving it are different things. I know. Her voice was flat. Not defeated, just honest. But I'd rather know than not know what we're dealing with. Cole pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He picked up the Meridian Land Holdings letterhead and read it again. You should talk to Reeves about this. I'm going to, this week. She paused. Walter Reeves is a careful man. He won't say anything he can't support, but he's been in this town a long time and he knows where things are connected. He'll want to see everything you have. I know. I've been organizing it. She looked at the papers, then at Cole. This is outside the scope of the partnership agreement. Yes. You didn't sign on to fight a corrupt banker. No, he said. I signed on to save a ranch. Those might turn out to be the same thing. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she gathered the papers together in their careful order and put them back in the leather portfolio she kept them in. Stay for coffee, she said. It wasn't quite an invitation. It was more like a statement of the next practical thing, the way she handled most things. But it was something. All right, he said. She put more wood in the stove. Cole looked out the kitchen window at the south pasture where the cattle were moving slow and dark against the frost-gray ground, and thought about Gruber and Aldrich and Meridian Land Holdings and what exactly they were all standing in the middle of. The coffee came in 2 plain tin cups, and it was strong and too hot to drink immediately, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table where the partnership papers had been signed 6 weeks ago, and neither of them said anything for a few minutes, and that silence had a different quality than it had in those first weeks. Less careful. More like 2 people who had gotten used to the sound of each other's quiet. My husband trusted people too easily, Evelyn said. Not abruptly. It came naturally, like something she'd been holding at arm's length that had gotten close enough to say. It wasn't naivety. He was a good judge of character, in the normal sense. He could tell a dishonest horse trader from a straight one, but he didn't expect people to operate at the scale that Aldrich does. She turned her cup in her hands. He thought that if you did good work and paid your debts and treated people fairly, the system would work the way it was supposed to work. And mostly it does. Mostly. And when it doesn't, Cole said, when it doesn't, you find out that fair doesn't have anything to do with it. She looked at her coffee. I spent the first 6 months after Robert died angry at him for not seeing it coming, for not protecting us better, for taking that loan. She paused. Then I stopped being angry because being angry at a dead man it doesn't go anywhere. Cole thought about that, about the particular uselessness of being angry at someone who was no longer there to answer for themselves. He understood it from a direction she didn't know about, and he wasn't ready to explain that direction yet. What replaced the anger? He said. She looked up. Work, she said simply. Just work. He nodded. He understood that too. Outside, a horse whinnied from the barn, one of Evelyn's mares who had opinions about being left alone too long. Evelyn stood up and put on her coat without hurry. Cole stood as well. I'll check the fencing on the east side this afternoon, he said. Dutch said there was a section that might need another post. I'll come with you after I check on the mare. They went back outside into the cold, and the work continued, and the winter pressed down steadily, and 50 miles of bad road away, Arthur Aldrich kept his careful, patient records. Walter Reeves met with Evelyn on a Thursday, and Cole waited outside in the cold for an hour and a quarter while it happened. When she came down the stairs from Reeves's office above the general store, her expression was measured and tight. Well, he said, he says what I have isn't enough to bring to a judge. Not yet. She pulled her coat closed against the wind. But he also said that the Meridian Land Holdings Incorporation is a matter of public record and that there are legal avenues to examine the relationship between a bank director and a private land acquisition company, if that company is benefiting directly from the bank's foreclosure decisions. Meaning it's not nothing. Meaning if we can find one more piece, one document, one transaction that directly connects Aldrich to Meridian in a way that shows conflict of interest. She paused. He says the county recorder's office in Pueblo might have records that the local office doesn't. Cole thought about the ride to Pueblo, 4 hours each way in winter weather. When do you want to go? She looked at him. I was going to go alone. I know. When do you want to go? She studied his face for a moment in the way she did when she was deciding whether to accept help gracefully or argue about it. Then she pulled her coat tighter and looked down the main street of Iron Creek at the false-fronted buildings and the frozen mud of the road and the smoke coming from the chimneys. Saturday, she said, if the weather holds. The weather held. They rode to Pueblo on a cold, bright Saturday that was the kind of winter day that was beautiful to look at and brutal to be out in, and the county recorder's office was a small, overheated room staffed by a young clerk who was bored enough to be helpful. Evelyn knew exactly what she was looking for, which was the key. She'd prepared a list of specific documents and transactions to request, and she moved through the process with the same focused efficiency she brought to accounts and fence lines. Cole sat in a chair against the wall and read 2-week-old newspaper while she worked, and watched the clerk gradually become more attentive and less bored as Evelyn asked increasingly specific questions about the Meridian Land Holdings transactions. They were there for 3 hours. On the ride back, as the sun was going flat and orange behind the western range, Evelyn was quiet for the first mile. Cole rode beside her and didn't push it. There was a deed transfer, she said finally. The Sutter property. The sale went to Meridian Land Holdings for $4,200. But there was a secondary transaction, filed 6 weeks later, transferring a 20% interest in the Sutter parcel to a private individual. She paused. Filed under the name Arthur J. Aldrich. Cole rode with that for a moment. The horses moved steady beneath them, breath coming in small clouds in the cold air. He's taking personal cuts, Cole said, from the properties his own bank forecloses on. Her voice was flat and hard. It's fraud. If it can be proven that he's steering foreclosure decisions to benefit his own private holdings, it's fraud. Reeves needs to see that document. I had the clerk make a certified copy. She patted the satchel across her saddle. I have it here. Cole looked at her. In the flat winter light, with the cold color in her cheeks and her jaw set at that particular angle, she looked like someone who had been carrying a fight inside herself for a long time and had finally found the right ground to plant it on. We need to be careful, he said. If Aldrich finds out you're building a case, he might move faster on the mortgage. She'd already thought of it. I know. That's why Reeves needs to move on this quickly, before Aldrich has any reason to think his position is being examined. And in the meantime, we keep our heads down and keep working. Yes. She looked straight ahead at the road. We keep working. The ranch in December was a relentless thing. Cold mornings that started in the dark, cold evenings that ended the same way, and a long stretch of hard physical work in between. Cole's hands were cracked and raw from the cold and the constant work with wire and wood and wet leather. Evelyn's were worse. She refused to wear her heaviest gloves when she was doing fine work like harness repair because she said she couldn't feel what she was doing through them, which was practical, and also the kind of stubbornness that he'd stopped arguing with. Clara turned 13 in February. They were deep in winter by then, the cold settled in permanently, and Evelyn made a cake from their limited stores, a plain yellow cake with dried apple filling. And the three of them ate it at the kitchen table in the Harper house, with the stove cranked up and the wind working the shutters outside. Cole had brought a small gift, a good leather-bound journal with blank pages that he'd ordered from Henderson's 3 weeks before, and asked Evelyn not to mention in advance. When Clara opened it, she looked at it for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. It's for whatever you want, he said, when the silence went slightly past comfortable. Writing, drawing, records, whatever you use. Clara ran her fingers over the cover. I used to write things down, she said. Before. She didn't explain before, and neither of them asked. I stopped after my father died. You can start again when you want to, Evelyn said. Her voice was gentle in the particular way she was gentle with Clara. Not soft, exactly, but without the guardedness she carried in most other directions. Clara looked at her mother, then at Cole. Thank you, she said. Then she put the journal aside with a carefulness that told him she'd use it. They ate cake, and the wind rattled the shutters, and the stove made its comfortable ticking sounds, and it was the closest thing to an ordinary evening that the Harper Ranch had offered up in a long time. It was 3 days after Clara's birthday that Reeves sent a note to Evelyn asking her to come to his office as soon as convenient. She went the next morning. When she came back to the ranch that afternoon, Cole was in the barn working on the tack, and he heard her horse come in faster than usual. She came into the barn and stood in the doorway, and he looked at her face and set down the bridle. "What is it?" "Reeves sent a letter to the state banking authority in Denver," she said. "2 weeks ago, with the Pueblo documents and everything else I'd given him." She paused. "They wrote back. They're opening a preliminary inquiry into the First National Bank of Iron Creek and Arthur Aldrich's management of foreclosure proceedings." Cole stood up from the bench. It's not enough yet. Reeves says a preliminary inquiry can take months, and Aldrich won't be notified immediately, but if he has any connections to the state authority, and Reeves thinks he might, he could find out." She was still standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame. The cold afternoon light was behind her. "Reeves says we need to be prepared for the possibility that Aldrich moves on the mortgage before the inquiry reaches any conclusion. How long do we have before the next payment is due?" 40 days. Her voice was precise. "And we're going to be short. Not badly short, but short." Cole looked at the tackroom wall. Did some arithmetic he already knew the answer to. "How short?" $200, maybe $250. He stood quietly for a moment. $200 was not an impossible sum, but it was not a trivial one either, not in the middle of winter with markets slow and spring still 2 months away. He thought about the timber stand on his north ridge. He thought about the mill in Pueblo that had been interested for 2 years. "I'll ride to Pueblo next week," he said. "Talk to the mill about the timber." "Cole." She said his name plainly, without the usual Mr. Maverick formality, and he registered it even if he didn't react to it. "You've already put in everything you agreed to and more. You're not obligated." "I know I'm not obligated." His voice was even. "I'm choosing." She looked at him. In the dim barn light, with the cold coming in around her from the door, she looked, not fragile. Nothing about Evelyn Harper was fragile, but tired in a way that she didn't let show much. The particular tiredness of someone who has been the one making decisions and absorbing blows for too long without anyone beside them. "Why do you keep choosing this?" she said. Her voice was quiet, and it wasn't accusatory. It was genuine. A woman who had been trying to understand something for 2 months and was now asking directly. He thought about a dozen different answers and discarded most of them for being either too much or not enough, and said the one that was simply true. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because—" He stopped, picked up the bridle again, not because he needed it, but to have somewhere to put his hands. "Because this ranch deserves to keep going, and so do you." The barn was very quiet. Outside, one of the horses moved in its stall with a soft sound of hooves on straw. Evelyn stood in the doorway for another moment, and something in her face moved, not dramatically, not in a way that asked for anything, but something eased, like a door that had been braced from inside shifting very slightly on its hinges. "Thank you," she said. The way she said it was different from the polite thank you she offered for practical things. It had weight in it. Then she pushed off the door frame and went toward the house, and Cole stood in the barn alone with the cold air moving in where she'd been, and went back to work. The timber sale came through at the end of February. Not as much as Cole had hoped, because winter prices were low, but enough. The mill buyer was a straightforward man named Carver, who drove a hard bargain but kept to it, and Cole rode back from Pueblo with enough in his coat pocket to cover the mortgage payment with $70 left over. The payment was made on a gray Monday morning. Cole went with Evelyn this time. He told her he had business at the bank anyway, which was half true. He did need to check his own account, but he also went because Aldrich had smiled last time, and he wanted Aldrich to see that Evelyn Harper was not coming in alone. Aldrich received them in his office. He was exactly as Cole remembered him. Compact, precise, expensive coat. The kind of careful grooming that announced to a room that a man took himself seriously. He looked at the money Evelyn set on his desk, and looked at the account ledger and wrote a receipt in a hand that was very controlled and showed nothing. "Mrs. Harper," he said pleasantly. "And Mr. Maverick, isn't it?" He looked at Cole with an expression that was polite and entirely empty of anything behind it. "I understand you've entered into a business arrangement with Mrs. Harper." "That's right," Cole said. "Admirable. Aldrich signed the receipt and pushed it across the desk. It's always encouraging to see the community supporting one another through difficulties. He looked at Evelyn. The next payment will be due in 60 days, Mrs. Harper. I trust that won't present a problem. It won't, Evelyn said. She picked up the receipt and put it in her satchel. Aldrich folded his hands on the desk. The property is looking better, I hear. Work being done. He tilted his head slightly. Let's hope it continues. It was the most innocuous statement in the world, and it had a blade in it that only someone looking for it would find. Cole looked at Aldrich across the desk, and Aldrich looked back at Cole with eyes that were assessing and careful, and for a moment the office was very quiet. It'll continue, Cole said. They walked out into the cold street and didn't speak until they were half a block from the bank. Then Evelyn said quietly, He knows something. He suspects something, Cole said. He doesn't know. He will. She said it without panic, just as a fact to be dealt with. Reeves needs to move faster. I'll talk to Reeves today. She nodded. The street was busy around them. Wagons, horses, the ordinary commerce of an ordinary town that didn't know what was moving underneath it. She stood for a moment with her hands in her coat pockets and her face turned slightly away from him, looking down the street at nothing in particular. Robert used to say, she said, that the hardest part of ranching wasn't the weather or the markets or the sick cattle. It was the patience. The part where you've done everything right and you just have to wait and see what the land gives back. She was quiet for a second. I'm not very good at that part. Neither am I, Cole said. She looked at him sideways, something almost like a dry smile. No, I didn't think so. They parted at the corner and went their separate ways down the cold street of Iron Creek, and the winter that had been pressing down since October wasn't done with any of them yet. March came in sideways, the way it always did in the lower valley. Not with the clean break from winter that people hoped for, but with a week of false warmth that got the mud moving and the cattle restless, followed by a hard freeze that locked everything back down again and left you feeling personally deceived. Cole's knee hated March. He'd learned to just accept that and keep moving. The ranch was showing progress that you could see if you'd known what it looked like before. The fences were solid now, all the way around the perimeter. Dutch and Pete had finished the last section in late February, working through 2 days of sleet to get it done. The stock pond was holding water clean and clear, the spring channel running exactly the way Robert Harper had intended it to run when he'd spent 3 weeks digging it 11 years ago. The cattle that had wintered on the creek meadow were thin but healthy, which in a hard winter was about the best you could ask for. The calving had started. This was the moment the whole winter of preparation either paid off or didn't, and both Cole and Evelyn knew it. The first week of March brought 7 calves, 4 heifers, and 3 bulls, all healthy, all strong on their feet within the hour. Evelyn recorded each one in the ledger with a handwriting that was smaller and more controlled than usual, the way her writing got when she was concentrating on something that mattered more than she wanted to show. Clara had appointed herself unofficial birth recorder. She was in the barn at 5 in the morning on the 3rd calving of the season, wrapped in her father's old coat, sitting on a hay bale with the leather journal Cole had given her open on her knee, writing down the time and the weight estimate and a brief description. Cole found her there when he came in with the lantern and almost tripped over her in the dark. "You should be sleeping," he said. "I was sleeping." She didn't look up from the journal. Then I heard the cow. He looked at the calf, a heifer, red-brown like her mother, already trying to stand on legs that weren't quite certain of themselves yet. "Did you get everything down?" 3:47 in the morning, heifer, red coat, white patch on the left ear. She was breech. "You had to turn her." Clara looked up at him. "I wrote down what you did, in case we need to do it again next year." Cole looked at the girl sitting on the hay bale in her too big coat with her journal and her careful notes, and felt something that was close to pride but was also close to sadness. Because a 13-year-old who took that kind of initiative had been shaped partly by the understanding that adults couldn't always be counted on to remember everything, and that sometimes you had to be the one who kept the records yourself. "Good thinking," he said. She closed the journal and tucked it inside her coat against her chest. "Mr. Maverick," she said, "do you think we're going to be okay?" He crouched down to check on the calf, partly because it needed checking and partly to have a moment to think about the right answer. The calf butted at his hand with a wet nose. "I think we're doing the right things," he said. "That's the most anybody can say." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Mama doesn't sleep much," she said. "She gets up in the middle of the night and sits at the table. She doesn't know I can hear her." Cole looked at the calf. "She's got a lot to carry." "I know." A pause. "I just wish she didn't have to carry it alone." He looked at Clara. She was looking at the calf with a face that was very young and also very old at the same time, the way children get when they've been paying attention to adult pain for long enough that they start to understand the weight of it without being able to do anything about it. "She's not as alone as she was," he said. Clara looked at him then and didn't say anything and went back to watching the calf. After a while, the mother cow moved to clean her new calf with a rough tongue, and the calf's legs found their first real grip on the straw, and that was enough for the moment. The letter from Reeves came on a Tuesday in the second week of March. Cole was at his own ranch that morning, doing overdue work on his own fence line, when his closest neighbor, an old rancher named Seb Crane, who did occasional mail runs into town, brought it out. Cole saw the envelope and knew from the quality of the paper that it wasn't good news. He opened it standing at the fence with his gloves still on, reading it twice in the pale morning light. Reeves wrote carefully, in the measured language of a man who understood that written words had weight and consequences. The state banking authority's preliminary inquiry, he explained, had indeed been opened. However, Arthur Aldrich had been made aware of the inquiry. The mechanism by which this happened was unclear, though Reeves had his suspicions, and had responded by retaining a Denver law firm of considerable reputation to represent both himself and the First National Bank. The inquiry would continue, Reeves wrote, but the timeline had been extended significantly, and the legal representation Aldrich had secured would make the process slower and more complex than had been hoped. More immediately, and this was the part that Cole read a third time, Aldrich had filed a formal notice with the bank's board of directors, citing what he termed deteriorating collateral conditions and irregular account management in the Harper mortgage account. Under the terms of the original loan agreement, which Robert Harper had signed in good faith in 1881, the bank held the right to demand full repayment of the outstanding principal if it could demonstrate that the collateral property had materially declined in value or that the account showed evidence of irregular management. The outstanding principal on the Harper mortgage was $2,900. Aldrich was demanding full repayment within 30 days. Cole folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, and stood at the fence for a minute looking at the mountains. The sky was very blue above the white peaks, the clear, cold blue that Colorado put on in March like a clean shirt. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put his tools away, saddled his horse, and rode to the Harper ranch. Evelyn already had the letter. Reeves had sent her a separate notice, and she was sitting at the kitchen table when Cole arrived, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold, looking at the document in front of her. She looked up when he came in, and her face told him everything he needed to know about where she was. Not broken. He needed to be clear about that. There was nothing in Evelyn Harper's face that was broken. But there was something stripped back, like bark off a tree in a bad storm. The tree was still standing, the roots were still in, but the surface that usually protected it was gone, and you could see the raw wood underneath. "How did he know about the inquiry?" Cole said, hanging his coat by the door. "Reeves thinks someone at the state authority office talked." Her voice was controlled. "A clerk, maybe. Someone who owes Aldrich a favor, or owes someone who owes Aldrich a favor." She looked back at the document. "It doesn't matter how. He knows." And he moved. Cole poured himself coffee from the pot and sat down across from her. $2,900 in 30 days. Yes. Selling cattle won't cover it. Not at March prices, not with what we have. No. She said it without flinching. "I've been doing the arithmetic since 6 this morning. If we sell every marketable animal on the property right now, which would effectively end the operation, we might raise $1,500 at best." She paused. "Your remaining savings after the partnership investment and the timber sale." "Not enough either," he said. "I've got maybe $800 in the Iron Creek account. Together, that's still $400 short at minimum." She set down the coffee cup. "And selling everything we have means the ranch has no future even if we make this payment. We'd be paying to keep a shell." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, March was doing its complicated thing, cold and bright at the same time, the kind of day that couldn't make up its mind. "Reeves," Cole said. Can he challenge the demand legally? He's already looking at it. The deteriorating collateral conditions claim is thin. The ranch is in considerably better shape than it was 6 months ago, and we have documentation to prove it. But Aldrich's lawyers will drag out any legal challenge, and the 30-day clock doesn't stop while the lawyers argue. She looked at him directly. Even if Reeves wins the argument eventually, we could lose the ranch while we're winning. Cole sat with that. There's one more thing, Evelyn said. Her voice changed, not softer but more careful, like she was handling something she wasn't sure about the weight of. Reeves thinks Aldrich timed this specifically. The preliminary inquiry threatens him, but it also gave him information. He knows we've been working together. He knows the ranch is recovering. He knows we made the last mortgage payment. So he's moving now, before the recovery becomes impossible to dispute, before the inquiry produces anything actionable, before we have another season to build on. She paused. He's not trying to foreclose because the ranch is failing. He's trying to foreclose because it's starting to succeed. Cole set his cup down. Because if we turn it around, he said slowly, and the inquiry proceeds and it comes out what he's been doing, he loses not just the Harper property, but his position and possibly his freedom. Her voice was flat. The Harper Ranch is a loose thread. If he can pull it quickly enough before anyone can see the whole pattern, he thinks the problem goes away. Yes. They sat with that for a moment. The particular ugliness of it, the precise calculation behind a man deciding to move against a woman and her daughter, not because he needed to, but because it was convenient for him, because they were a detail he wanted to clean up before the larger picture became visible. Cole's jaw was tight. He became aware of it and made himself ease it deliberately. Getting angry at Arthur Aldrich right now wasn't useful. What was useful was the $2,900 they needed to find in 30 days. My brother, he said. Evelyn looked at him. It was the first time he'd mentioned a brother in the 4 months she'd known him. She registered this without making anything obvious of it, just a slight stillness that told him she was paying attention. James, he said. He runs a livestock operation in New Mexico, Santa Fe County. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. We haven't spoken in a while, but he wrote me 2 years ago about potentially investing in a northern property. He was looking to diversify into Colorado grazing land. He paused. He has capital. How much of a while? Evelyn said carefully. 7 years? She absorbed this. What happened 7 years ago? Cole looked at the table. This was the direction he'd been avoiding since October, the door that had always been there in the background of their working relationship, that he'd been keeping firmly closed because behind it was the part of his life he'd come to Iron Creek to get away from. He thought about how much to say and what it had to do with the immediate situation, and decided to say what was necessary and no more. My son died, he said. He was 22. An accident. A river crossing that went wrong in high water. He said it evenly, because he'd learned to say it evenly. James and I had a disagreement about what came before, about decisions I'd made. We said things that were... He stopped. Things don't unsay themselves, is the point. We went our separate ways. Evelyn was very still across the table. He's the only person I know who could raise that kind of capital on short notice, Cole said. I'd be asking him to invest in the partnership, not as a loan, as a third stake. Smaller percentage, enough to cover the deficit. You'd have to contact him. Yes. She looked at him steadily. He'd learned to read her silences well enough by now to know that this one wasn't judgment. It was the careful thinking she did before she said something that mattered. That's a significant thing to ask of yourself, she said, for someone else's problem. It stopped being only someone else's problem about 4 months ago, he said. And it's a significant thing to do regardless. I'm aware of that. She was quiet again. You don't have to... Evelyn. He said her name the same way she'd said his in the barn 2 months ago, plainly, without the formal distance. Let me write the letter. We can decide what to do with whatever James writes back. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, the precise nod. All right. He wrote the letter that evening at his kitchen desk, and it took him 4 drafts over 3 hours, which was 4 more drafts than he'd needed for any business correspondence in recent memory. The first draft was too formal. It read like a contract proposal from a stranger, which was in some ways what he'd become to James, but wasn't how he wanted to lead. The second draft went too far in the other direction, addressed the 7-year silence too directly and too soon, turned into something that was more about the past than the present. The third draft tried to split the difference and felt false in both directions. The fourth draft was short. He wrote that he was well. He wrote that he was involved in a partnership in the lower valley, a good piece of land with a solid cattle operation that was being threatened by predatory banking practices, and that he was looking for an investor who could provide capital quickly in exchange for a minority stake in a property that was worth considerably more than its current debt suggested. He wrote the numbers plainly. He wrote that he hoped James was well, and that Margaret was well, and that the New Mexico operation was prospering. Then he looked at the letter for a while. Then he wrote one more line. I know I'm the last person you expected to hear from. I'm sorry it took an emergency for me to find the words. But here we are. He sealed it before he could second-guess it and rode into town the next morning to post it. The waiting was the worst part. Cole had always been better at action than at waiting, which was a significant character deficiency in ranching, and he managed it the way he always managed it, by working. He and Evelyn pushed into the spring preparation with the urgency of people who understood that the work itself was the only productive response to the uncertainty. They expanded the East Pasture clearing. They assessed the cattle that would be ready to market in June, building a detailed picture of what the summer income might look like if they made it to summer. They documented the ranch's improvements meticulously: fence records, cattle weights, water access, land condition. Because Reeves had said documentation was their best argument against Aldrich's deteriorating collateral claim, and if it came to a legal challenge, they needed every number to be unassailable. Clara helped with the documentation. She had turned out to have a real gift for organization. She could look at a pile of records and see the structure in them faster than either of the adults. And she had a memory for detail that Evelyn said came from Robert's side of the family, although she said it in a tone that suggested she was allowing Robert this posthumous credit somewhat generously. It was during one of these documentation sessions at the kitchen table, the three of them going through cattle records, Cole reading numbers, Clara writing them in the ledger, Evelyn cross-referencing against the winter feed records, that Ted Gruber's wagon was seen passing the Harper Ranch Road for the second time in a week. Clara saw it first. She was nearest the window. "That's Mr. Gruber's wagon," she said, in a neutral tone that was carefully not the tone she wanted to use. Evelyn looked up from her papers. Cole turned in his chair. The wagon was moving at an easy pace down the road, not stopping, not slowing. Gruber was up on the seat. Cole could see the bulk of him even at this distance. There was another man beside him that Cole didn't recognize. "Second time this week," Evelyn said. "Third," Claire said quietly. "He came past Tuesday morning too when you were both in the south pasture." Cole looked at the wagon until it disappeared around the bend. "He's checking on things." "He's checking on whether we're still here," Evelyn said. Her voice had gone to that flat, hard place. Cole stood up. "I'm going to talk to Reeves again today. I want to know the exact legal timeline, what Aldrich can and can't do, day by day over the next 30 days. And I want to know if there's any legal barrier we can put in place against a prearranged sale." "A prearranged sale," Evelyn said, and the way she said it told him she'd been thinking about the same thing. If Aldrich moved to foreclosure auction quickly, and Gruber or Meridian Land Holdings was already positioned to buy, if the auction was arranged rather than competitive, the ranch could change hands in a matter of days. "Reeves needs to file something," Cole said. "A formal challenge to the demand, even if it only buys us time. Every day we're in legal limbo is a day the ranch is still ours." Evelyn pulled her coat from the hook by the door. "I'm coming with you." "Clara," he started. "I'll stay," Clara said. She said it the way her mother would have said it. Not a child accepting an assignment, but a person making a decision. "I'll finish the cattle records. You'll need them complete." They rode into Iron Creek together, and Reeves listened to them across his cluttered desk with the focused attention of a man who had been practicing law long enough to understand that the difference between legal theory and what actually happened in practice was often significant, and that the next 30 days were going to be a demonstration of that difference. He could file a formal challenge to the accelerated repayment demand, he said. The grounds were legitimate. The original loan terms did not clearly support Aldrich's interpretation of deteriorating collateral, and the timing of the demand relative to the banking authority inquiry created an appearance of retaliatory action that a judge might find significant. The challenge wouldn't stop the clock, but it would create a legal record, and in the best-case scenario, a judge might issue a temporary stay. Best case, Evelyn said. What's the realistic case? Reeves folded his hands. The realistic case is that Aldrich's Denver lawyers will respond quickly and aggressively, and that we'll have perhaps 10 days before a judge has to make a decision about the stay. He paused. In those 10 days, you need to either raise the money or demonstrate a credible plan to raise it that a judge would consider sufficient cause to extend the timeline. How much would the judge need to see as a credible plan? Cole said. A committed investor with documented funds who can make a binding commitment within a short time frame. Reeves looked at Cole over his glasses. Is there such a person? There might be, Cole said. I'm waiting on a letter. Reeves nodded slowly. Then file my challenge today and hope the letter comes before the 10 days are up. They authorized the filing and rode back out of town in a silence that had the texture of two people who were thinking hard and didn't want to interrupt each other's thinking. The afternoon was one of those bright, cold March days that had no sympathy in them, too clear and sharp for comfort. Half a mile out of town, Evelyn said, "Tell me about your son." Cole didn't answer immediately. The horses moved beneath them, and the road ran straight ahead between the winter-brown fields. His name was Daniel, he said. He was a good young man, better than me in most ways that counted. He said it factually, not self-pityingly. He had his mother's way with people. Could walk into a room full of strangers, and inside of 10 minutes you'd have thought he'd known all of them for years. A pause. His mother died when he was 15. Fever. After that, it was just the two of us running the operation in Wyoming. Evelyn was quiet, listening. James, my brother, he had opinions about how I was raising Daniel. He thought I worked the boy too hard, that I used the ranch as a way to avoid dealing with losing Margaret. Cole's voice was steady, but had a quality in it like something being said through effort. He wasn't entirely wrong. I knew it then too. I just didn't know what else to do. He paused. Daniel crossed the Laramie River on a spring drive. Water was high from the snowmelt. His horse went out from under him. Another pause, shorter. James said if I hadn't pushed him so hard for so long, if I'd let him live a different kind of life, he wouldn't have been there, in that water. The road curved slightly around the base of a low hill, and the Harper Ranch came into view ahead. The house, the barn, the fences they'd rebuilt, the smoke coming thin and straight from the chimney because Clara had kept the stove going. And you think he was right, Evelyn said. Not a question. I think he was partly right, Cole said, which is worse than being entirely wrong because you can't put the partly right aside. It stays. Evelyn looked at the road ahead. That's why you came here. Iron Creek. I needed somewhere I didn't know anybody, and nobody knew me. And then a woman walked into a saloon. Something caught in his chest, not painfully, more the way a door catches on a loose board. He looked at her profile. She was watching the road, her face angled forward, but there was something in the set of her mouth that wasn't quite neutral. And then a woman walked into a saloon, he said. She didn't say anything else. They rode the last half mile to the Harper Ranch in silence, and the smoke from the chimney got clearer and the fence lines he'd spent the winter rebuilding ran straight and solid to either side of the gate. And Clara came to the barn door when she heard the horses because she'd been listening, because that was what Clara did. The letter from James arrived on a Friday. Cole was at his own ranch when Seb Crane brought it out, and he stood in his front yard in the cold and opened it with hands that he noticed were not entirely steady, which was information about himself that he accepted without comment. James Maverick wrote in a hand that was almost identical to Cole's. The same slightly forward slant, the same way of making the letter T. Cole hadn't seen his brother's handwriting in 7 years, and the familiarity of it did something unexpected to him. He stood in the yard and let it do that thing, and then kept reading. James wrote that he'd received Cole's letter. He wrote that he was glad to know Cole was well. He wrote that Margaret, James's wife, not Cole's, they'd both married Margaret's, a coincidence that the family had found either charming or confusing, depending on who you asked, was well, and that their operation in New Mexico had grown considerably, and that 2 of their 3 children were now working the ranch with them. Then he wrote, "You were right that I didn't expect to hear from you. I won't pretend the last 7 years haven't happened, because they did happen, and I expect we'll need to talk about that sometime when it's not a letter. But I'll tell you what I'll tell any man who comes to me with a straight proposition. I'll look at the numbers and I'll tell you what I can do. He'd included a list of questions, precise, business-minded questions about the property valuation, the outstanding debt, the partnership structure, the cattle operation, the legal situation with the bank. The questions of a man who'd spent decades making investment decisions and wasn't going to let sentiment override sense, which was fair and which Cole had expected. At the bottom of the letter, below the questions, James had written one more line. I'm sorry about what I said. I've been sorry for a long time. I just didn't know how to say it to someone who wasn't in the room. Cole folded the letter. He held it for a moment in both hands, standing in his yard with the March wind moving around him and the mountains white and still to the west. Then he went inside and sat down at the desk and wrote back 13 pages, everything James had asked for, and then the one line James had needed him to say, I know, me too. He posted the letter that afternoon and rode to the Harper Ranch to tell Evelyn. She was in the barn with a 2-week-old calf that had been slow to thrive. She'd been supplementing its feeding herself twice a day for the past week. She looked up when he came in, saw his face, and set down the feeding bucket. He wrote back, she said. He wrote back. Cole leaned against the stall. He wants details. Full documentation, everything. I'll need to put together a package for him. Land valuation, cattle records, financial projections, the partnership structure. Claire and I can have that ready in 2 days. He's in New Mexico, the mail. Wire, Evelyn said immediately. Send the summary by telegraph. Send the full documentation to follow by express mail. If he can wire back a commitment, she was already calculating. He could see it. Wire takes 2 days maximum. If he commits in principle, Reeves can use that to support the stay application. Cole looked at her across the stall. This woman who had $11 4 months ago and was now running calculations on telegraph logistics in the middle of feeding a struggling calf. When did you get so good at crisis management? He said. About 18 months ago, she said. I had no choice. The calf butted at the bucket, stronger than last week. Evelyn looked down at it with an expression that was as close to tenderness as she let herself go in front of other people. She's getting stronger, she said. Another week and she won't need me for this. That's good. Yes. She looked at him. It's good when things don't need you as much anymore. Means they're surviving. He wasn't entirely sure they were still talking about the calf. He thought maybe they weren't, and he thought maybe Evelyn wasn't entirely sure either, and neither of them said anything else about it, because they were both people who moved toward the practical thing when the other kind of thing got too close. 2 days on the documentation, she said. Then we wire James, and we wait. And we wait, he said. She went back to the calf. Cole went to find what else needed doing, and outside the light was going gold over the hills, and the 30 days were running. And somewhere in a Denver law office, Arthur Aldrich's lawyers were preparing their response to Reeves's challenge. And in Santa Fe County, New Mexico, a man who looked like Cole but had spent 7 years not talking to him was sitting with a letter and making a decision. The telegraph office in Iron Creek was a narrow room between the barbershop and the feed store, operated by a young man named Ellis, who had the particular energy of someone who understood that he sat at the center of the fastest communication in the territory and took that responsibility seriously. Cole and Evelyn were there when it opened at 8 in the morning, 2 days after James's letter arrived, with the condensed summary of the Harper Ranch partnership that Clara had spent the better part of those 2 days helping organize into something that could be transmitted in a reasonable number of words. Ellis counted the words twice and gave Cole a price. Cole paid it without flinching, which took some effort because it was not a small amount, and watched Ellis tap out the message in that rapid, precise rhythm that always struck Cole as a kind of language he'd never learned to read. Then they went to wait. Waiting, when you're already waiting on a legal clock, has a specific quality to it that normal waiting doesn't have. Every hour that passed without a response from James was an hour off the 30 days Reeves had started with, reduced further by the time already consumed in filing the legal challenge and preparing the documentation. The judge in Pueblo, who had jurisdiction over the stay application, had given Aldrich's lawyers until the following Monday to respond. That was 6 days away. If James wired back a commitment before Monday, Reeves could include it in the stay argument. If he didn't, they'd be presenting the case without it, on the thinner grounds of the legal challenge alone. Cole went back to his ranch and worked. It was the only thing that made the waiting manageable. He was repairing the roof of his smaller outbuilding, long overdue work that he'd been putting off since fall. And he spent 2 days on the roof in the cold wind driving nails with more force than strictly necessary, which at least got the job done efficiently. Evelyn, when he rode over on the second afternoon, was doing the same thing in a different direction. She'd started on the scrub clearing on the east slope that they'd talked about in December, the project that would expand the upper pasture, the one they'd said was a spring job. She was out there with an axe and a determination that had something driven about it, the way a person works when they're putting physical effort between themselves and the thing they're afraid of. Cole rode up and watched her for a moment before she heard him. She was swinging the axe with the mechanical consistency of someone who'd been at it for a while, working along a line she'd marked with stakes, the cut brush piling up to one side. Her coat was open despite the cold. Her hair was coming loose from its braid. He dismounted and tied the horse. "You're going to wreck your shoulder," he said. She paused mid-swing, looked at him, then completed the swing, which landed slightly less cleanly than the ones before it, and lowered the axe. "I needed to do something," she said. "I know." He picked up the second axe that was leaning against a cut stump. "Move over." They worked side by side for an hour without talking much, which was something they'd gotten comfortable with months ago. The particular companionable silence of two people doing hard work in the same space. The brush pile grew. The line of cleared ground extended slowly up the slope. It was Evelyn who broke the silence. "If James doesn't commit," she said between swings, "we're $400 short of the full amount, at minimum." "I know. Even with a legal stay, if we can't demonstrate the full amount is available." "I know, Evelyn." She stopped working. He stopped a beat after her. They both looked at the slope, the cut brush, the stakes marking the future pasture line. "I have jewelry," she said. Her voice was flat and practical, the way she talked about difficult things. "Robert's watch. A few pieces that were my mother's. I haven't wanted to sell them, but they might be worth $150, maybe $200, if I found the right buyer." Cole looked at her profile. She was not looking at him. Her jaw was set at that angle. "Don't sell them yet," he said. "Cole, not yet. Give James until Monday." She turned the axe handle in her hands, a slow rotation, looking at the ground. "He might say no," she said. "He'd have every right to. It's a significant investment from a man who—" She stopped. "Who you haven't spoken to in 7 years, on the basis of a letter and a telegraph." "He might say no," Cole agreed. "But I don't think he will." She looked at him then. "How do you know?" He thought about the last line of James's letter. "I've been sorry for a long time. I just didn't know how to say it to someone who wasn't in the room." "Because the letter he wrote me wasn't just a business response," he said. "And James is a practical man. If it was only business, he'd have wired a yes or no already." He paused. "He's thinking about more than the investment." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the axe again. "All right," she said. "Until Monday." They worked until the light went, and Cole rode home in the dark with his shoulders aching and his bad knee complaining about the hours of standing on uneven ground. And he sat at his kitchen desk that evening and looked at the telegraph receipt and thought about James in New Mexico with the documentation package spread on his own desk, doing his own calculations, thinking about more than one kind of debt. The wire came Saturday morning. Cole was at the Harper Ranch when Ellis sent his boy out with it. A 10-year-old named Pete Jr. who made the ride with the self-important speed of a child who understands he's carrying something that matters. Cole was in the yard splitting wood when he saw the boy coming up the road at a canter, and something in his chest went very still. He met the boy at the gate and read the wire standing there. James Maverick had agreed to invest. The amount he'd committed was enough to cover not only the deficit, but the full outstanding balance, the complete $2,900, plus enough margin to cover Reeves's legal fees and leave something in reserve. He'd wired the funds to a Denver bank, transferable upon receipt of the formal partnership documentation, and he was prepared to travel to Iron Creek within 2 weeks to sign the papers in person. The last line of the wire, which Ellis had transmitted faithfully, was, "Tell me when. I'll be there." Cole stood at the gate with the wire in his hand, and the boy looking up at him waiting to know if there was a reply to send back, and the March morning bright and sharp around him, and he thought about 7 years and 13 pages, and a man who had his handwriting, and he felt something shift in his chest that had been stuck in the same place since a spring river crossing in Wyoming a long time ago. Not gone, not healed exactly, but moved. Like a stone that's been sitting on the same piece of ground for so long you'd forgotten it could move, and then something shifts beneath it. "Tell him yes," Cole said. "And tell him I'm glad." He gave the boy a coin for the ride and went to find Evelyn. She was in the kitchen with Clara, the two of them working through the morning accounts, and she looked up when Cole came through the door with the wire in his hand and read his face before she read the paper. She stood up from the table slowly. He handed her the wire. She read it. Clara watched her mother's face with the focused attention of a girl who had learned to read adult expressions the way sailors read weather. Evelyn set the wire on the table. She put both hands flat on the surface and looked at it for a moment. Then she sat back down in the chair, carefully, like someone whose legs have made a decision before the rest of them has. "Mom?" Clara said. "It's all right." Evelyn's voice was steady, but there was something in it that was more fragile at the edges than her normal voice. "It's good news. It's—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. Clara looked at Cole. Cole looked at Clara. The girl got up from her chair quietly, went around the table and put her hand on her mother's shoulder. Evelyn reached up and covered Clara's hand with her own and held it there. Cole gave them a moment. He went to the stove and refilled the coffee, which didn't need refilling, and stood at the window looking at the south pasture where the cattle were moving in the morning light. After a while, Evelyn said quietly, "We need to wire Reeves." "Already planned," Cole said. "I'll go now." "I'll come with you." "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to." Her voice had recovered its evenness. "I want to." Clara was still standing at her mother's shoulder. "What do I do?" she said. Practical, like her mother. Ready for an assignment. "Keep the accounts," Evelyn said, "and feed the calf. She doesn't need me anymore, remember? She's surviving." Something moved across Evelyn's face. The almost smile, but fuller this time, and warmer. Then just keep the accounts. They rode into Iron Creek, and the day was the best kind of March day. Cold but clear, with the mountains showing white and sharp against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at it. They sent the wire to Reeves and then went directly to his office, because some things are better handled in person, and Walter Reeves looked at them across his meticulous desk and read the copy of James's commitment wire with the careful expression of a man who is professionally restrained about good news, but is, underneath that restraint, genuinely relieved. "This changes the stay application significantly," he said. "A committed investor with documented funds transferable from a Denver bank. A judge will consider that strong evidence of capacity to meet the debt." He set the wire down. "I can have the updated application filed by end of day Monday. With this, I'd put our chances of a temporary stay at—" He paused because Walter Reeves didn't like percentages. "Reasonable," he said. "I'd call them reasonable. And if the stay is granted," Evelyn said, "how long does it hold while the banking authority inquiry continues?" "Potentially several months, long enough for the inquiry to produce findings, if it produces findings." He looked at them both over his glasses. "The inquiry is the key. Everything else is buying time for the inquiry to do its work." "Then we buy time," Cole said. Reeves nodded. Then he said, with the slightly awkward precision of a man making a personal observation in a professional context, "For what it's worth, the two of you have handled this with more steadiness than most people manage. I've seen foreclosure situations break people faster and harder than this." Evelyn looked at him. "It still might," she said, not bitterly, just honestly. "Yes," Reeves said, "it still might, but you've given yourself the best chance you could." They walked out of his office into the cold afternoon, and for a moment they both just stood on the landing at the top of the stairs above the general store, looking out at the main street of Iron Creek below them. Wagons and horses, a few people moving between the storefronts, smoke from the chimneys, the ordinary afternoon of a town that mostly didn't know what was being decided in its midst. "He's going to fight the stay," Evelyn said. "Aldrich." "Yes. His lawyers will argue the committed funds aren't sufficiently certain or that the timeline is too loose, or—" "Reeves knows what they'll argue," Cole said. "He's been doing this longer than Aldrich's Denver lawyers have been practicing." She leaned slightly against the railing, looking down at the street. Not defeated. She never looked defeated, not exactly, but carrying something. The weight of a person who has been under sustained pressure for long enough that even good news doesn't immediately feel light, because you've gotten so used to bracing for the next thing. I keep waiting for it to go wrong, she said. Somewhere. Some piece I haven't thought of. That's not paranoia, Cole said. That's just sense, given the last 6 months. Is there a point where it stops? He thought about it honestly. I think it gets quieter, he said. It doesn't stop, but it gets quieter. She looked at him. The afternoon light was in her face. Not flattering light, the honest kind that shows what's actually there. She looked tired and strong, and like a person who has been through something and is still in the middle of it and knows it. Is that from experience? She said. Yes, he said. She looked back at the street. The grief, she said. Not asking, acknowledging. The grief, he agreed. They stood on the landing for another minute in the cold, and then Evelyn straightened and pulled her coat together and said, practically, that they should get back because the afternoon was getting short. And Cole said yes, and they went down the stairs and got their horses and rode out of town. The Monday hearing, not a formal hearing exactly, more a submission review, went the way Reeves had predicted it might go, which was to say, not cleanly, but adequately. Aldrich's Denver lawyers were competent and aggressive, and they argued that a wire commitment from an out-of-state investor did not constitute sufficient proof of available funds, that the legal challenge to the accelerated repayment demand was procedurally weak, that the banking authority inquiry was a separate matter that had no bearing on the bank's contractual rights under the existing mortgage. The judge in Pueblo, a gray-haired woman named Judge Carver, who had been on the district bench for 15 years and had the manner of someone who had heard most varieties of legal argument and had opinions about all of them, listened to both sides without much visible reaction. She asked Reeves 4 questions and Aldrich's lawyer 6. She looked at the documentation package for longer than either side expected. Then she granted a 60-day stay. Not the months that Reeves had hoped for, but 60 days. The same number Aldrich had originally given Evelyn before he'd tightened it to 30. 60 days for the banking authority inquiry to advance. 60 days for the partnership funds to be formally transferred and documented. 60 days for something that looked like justice to find its footing in a situation that had been designed to prevent it. Reeves sent the wire to Cole Tuesday morning. Cole read it at his kitchen table and sat with it for a moment, then saddled his horse and rode to the Harper Ranch at a pace his bay gelding probably found excessive for a Tuesday. Evelyn was on the porch when he rode in. She'd seen him coming. You could see the road a long way from the Harper porch. And she was standing at the top of the steps with her arms crossed and her face carefully neutral in the way it got when she was waiting to know something she was afraid to know. He rode up and looked at her from the saddle. 60 days, he said. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them and looked at him and said, 60 days is enough. 60 days is enough, he agreed. He dismounted. She was still standing at the top of the steps, and he was at the bottom, and the distance between them was the 3 porch steps, and also something else that had been narrowing steadily since October without either of them formally acknowledging it. He stood there with his horse's reins in his hand and looked up at her. My brother will be here in 2 weeks, he said. I know. I'd like you to meet him properly, not just as a business partner, as... He stopped, found the word. As family. Evelyn went very still. Not the stillness of surprise, but the stillness of a person carefully considering the weight of a word that has been handed to them. Cole, she said. Her voice was quiet and not quite even. That's a significant thing to say. I know it is. We've known each other 5 months. I'm aware. And you're... She stopped, looked at him steadily. Are you saying what I think you're saying? He held her gaze. I'm saying that somewhere in 5 months of fence work and ledgers and cold mornings and a 13-year-old who keeps records of calf births at 4 a.m, I stopped thinking of this as someone else's problem and started thinking of it as mine. Not because of the partnership papers. He paused. Because of the people. The porch was very quiet. Somewhere across the pasture one of the cattle lowed, long and low. The March wind moved through the cottonwoods. Evelyn looked at him for a long time without speaking. and he let her look because that was what she needed to do when something mattered. "I'm not easy," she said finally. "I don't know if you've noticed." "I've noticed. I have a daughter who is 13 and has opinions about everything and is probably listening from behind that window right now." She did not look at the window. "And I have a ranch that is not finished being a problem. And I am—" She paused. "I am not the same person I was before Robert died. I don't know if that person is coming back." "I'm not looking for that person," Cole said. "I know the one who's standing on that porch." She looked at him. Something moved in her face. Not the almost smile, not the corner of the mouth movement. Something fuller and more complicated and more real than that. Something that had been waiting for permission. "You should come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." It was not a declaration. It was not a romantic overture in any formal sense. It was Evelyn Harper, being exactly who she was, offering the things she offered to people she was letting in. A seat at her table and a cup of hot coffee and the ordinary continued presence of her life going forward. Cole understood this completely. He tied his horse to the post and went up the steps. Clara was, in fact, standing just inside the front window. She made no attempt to pretend she wasn't. She looked at Cole when he came through the door, and her expression was the one she'd been wearing since February. The one that was too careful and too old for a 13-year-old, and that he'd been watching slowly, gradually, acquire the beginnings of something easier. "Is it good news?" she said. 60-day stay, Cole said. "Your mother can explain what that means." "I know what it means." Claire had been present for most of the legal discussions. "It means we have time." "It means we have time." She absorbed this. Then she said, with the matter-of-fact directness that was the most characteristic thing about her, "Are you going to stay? Not just for the ranch." Evelyn, at the stove, did not turn around. But Cole could see the set of her shoulders change slightly. "I think so," he said to Clara, "if that's all right with you." Clara considered him. She had a way of considering people that was very complete, that left you feeling like you'd been read with some accuracy. Then she nodded, the precise single nod, the one he'd known since October, the one that was unmistakably her mother's. "It's all right with me," she said. James Maverick arrived on a Thursday, 2 weeks to the day after he'd sent the wire, on the afternoon stage from Pueblo. Cole was at the stage stop when the coach pulled in, standing in the March cold with his hat in his hands, watching the passengers come down the steps with the particular uncertainty of a man who is about to see someone he hasn't seen in 7 years and doesn't know in advance what version of either of them will show up. James came down last. He was 2 years younger than Cole and looked it, which had always been the case. Their mother had said James got the easier version of the family face, which Cole had never disputed. He was broader through the shoulders than Cole remembered, gray at the temples now, carrying a single travel bag. He came off the coach step and stopped when he saw Cole, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then James crossed the distance between them and put out his hand, and Cole took it, and they shook, a firm, sustained grip that held for longer than a business handshake and didn't try to be more than what it was, which was two men acknowledging that they were still brothers, and that 7 years was a long time, and that they were both sorry about it. "You look old," James said. "You look fat," Cole said. James almost smiled. "Margaret's cooking." "Give her my thanks." They walked together toward the hotel where James would stay that night, and the afternoon was cold around them, and Iron Creek moved on its ordinary business. And they talked, haltingly at first, the way long-stopped things restart, about New Mexico and Colorado and the ranch and the partnership and Aldrich, all the practical surface-level things that gave them somewhere to put their voices, while the other things settled between them at a level that didn't need to be spoken yet. That evening, Cole brought James to the Harper Ranch for supper. Evelyn had cooked something that was better than her usual practical meals. A beef roast with dried apple and onion, biscuits, coffee that was strong and not from a tin. Clara set the table with the dishes that normally stayed in the cabinet, which Cole knew was a sign of something because he'd never seen those dishes out before. James sat across from Evelyn and spent most of supper asking her questions about the ranch, with the direct interest of a man assessing a business investment, which was fair and also useful because it gave Evelyn something concrete to talk about, rather than the more complicated thing that was also present in the room. She answered him with the same clear precision she brought to everything: numbers, timelines, projections, the state of the cattle operation, the legal situation. At some point during the meal, James looked from Evelyn to Cole and back to Evelyn with an expression that suggested he was reading something additional in the picture that hadn't been in the documentation package. He didn't say anything about it. He went back to asking about the upper pasture clearing. Clara, for her part, asked James 3 questions about New Mexico, listened to the answers with full attention, and then said, "Is the land different there?" "Very different," James said. "Drier. More red in it. The mountains are a different shape." "Do you like it better than here?" James looked at her. "I like what I've built there," he said. "I don't know this place well enough yet to compare." Clara considered this seriously. "You should come back in summer," she said. "The valley's different in summer. You'd have to see it to know." James looked at Cole. Cole looked at his coffee cup. James's expression, for a man who is good at not showing things, showed something. Something that was warm around the edges and slightly wry, and was probably the closest he was going to get, at a first supper in a stranger's kitchen, to saying what he was actually thinking. After supper, when Evelyn and Clara had cleared the table and James and Cole were sitting with the last of the coffee, James said quietly, "She's good." "Yes," Cole said. "The ranch is good too. Better than I expected from the documentation." He turned his cup in his hands. "The documentation was excellent, by the way. Very complete. Clara organized most of it. That 13-year-old organized the investment documentation." "She has a system," Cole said. James looked at the kitchen, at the door through which Evelyn had gone, at the table that still had the good dishes on it. "Cole," he said, "is this—" He gestured vaguely in a way that encompassed more than the ranch. "Yes," Cole said. James nodded slowly, not with surprise, with the look of a man seeing something he'd been expecting and deciding how to feel about it. "She know that?" "We had a conversation. On a porch, I'd guess." James looked at him. "You always had important conversations on porches." Cole looked at his brother. 7 years was a long time. Long enough that you forgot the specific texture of knowing someone completely, the way they referenced things you'd both forgotten you both remembered, the way they could read a situation you were in because they'd known you before the situation started. "The papers," Cole said. "Tomorrow morning with Reeves." "Tomorrow morning," James agreed, then more quietly, "I meant what I wired. I'm glad you wrote." "I should have written sooner." "Yes," James said. "You should have. But you didn't, and then you did. And here we are." He picked up his coffee. "That's how most things work." They signed the partnership documents in Reeves's office Friday morning. 3 signatures on a new agreement that gave James a 15% stake and committed his capital to the full payoff of the outstanding mortgage balance. Reeves drafted a certified letter to the First National Bank of Iron Creek and to the Pueblo District Court, documenting the committed funds and their intended application. On the following Monday morning, 23 days before the original 30-day deadline would have expired, and 37 days before the 60-day stay, Evelyn Harper walked into the First National Bank of Iron Creek. She walked in alone. This had been her decision, stated flatly and not argued with. Cole had driven her to town. James had come with them, at his own insistence, but both men waited outside on the street. Cole leaning against the post by the bank's front door, James sitting on the bench by the barber shop, both of them visible through the bank's front window if Evelyn had chosen to look. She didn't choose to look. She went directly to the clerk and asked to see Arthur Aldrich. Aldrich kept her waiting 11 minutes, which was a calculated amount of time, long enough to be a statement, short enough to be deniable. She stood at the counter and waited without showing anything because 11 minutes was nothing compared to 18 months. He came out of his office with his banker's composure fully assembled, the expensive coat, the controlled expression, the hands that were always slightly clasped in front of him, as if he were about to say something measured. "Mrs. Harper," he said pleasantly, "this is unexpected." "I'd like to settle the mortgage," she said. "In full." A beat. Barely perceptible. "In full. $2,900. The complete outstanding principal." She opened her satchel and placed the certified bank draft on the counter. The funds had been transferred from the Denver bank that morning. Reeves had been at the Iron Creek Bank at opening, ensuring everything was in order. "I'd like a receipt and a clear title release, please." Aldrich looked at this bank draft. He looked at it for a long moment that had a lot of things in it. Calculations, recalibrations, the specific controlled response of a man who has had a plan come apart in front of him and is deciding in real time how to arrange his face about it. He picked up the draft, examined it. "This is from a partnership account," he said, carefully. "Yes, my partnership. Everything in order, Mr. Aldrich?" He looked at her. She looked at him. The bank was quiet around them. The clerk at the end of the counter finding something to look at. A customer near the door who had gone very still. "The funds are certified," Aldrich said finally. "Yes, they are." He set the draft down. His hands were very controlled. "This doesn't affect the bank's position regarding the banking authority inquiry," Evelyn said, quietly, without heat. "I know. That's a separate matter. This is the mortgage." She held his gaze. "Is there a problem with the payment, Mr. Aldrich?" Another beat. "No," he said. "There's no problem." "Good. I'll wait for the receipt and the title release documentation." She waited 18 minutes. The clerk processed the payment with the careful speed of someone doing everything correctly because they understood that everything they did was being noted. Aldrich returned to his office and did not come back out. When the documentation was in her hands, the receipt, the formal release, the clear title notation, Evelyn put it in her satchel and closed the clasp. She looked at the bank, at the counter, at the closed office door, at the clerk who did not quite meet her eyes. And she thought about Robert, who had walked into a bank and signed a paper in good faith and had trusted that a system designed to work fairly would work fairly. She walked out into the cold March morning. Cole was standing at the post. He looked at her face and read it the way he'd learned to read it over 5 months of hard mornings and difficult conversations. And what he saw there was not triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated than triumph, something that looks like relief but sits deeper. She stopped in front of him and opened the satchel and took out the title release and held it in both hands in the cold air. "It's done," she said. Cole looked at the paper, at her. James had come off the bench and was standing a few feet back, giving them whatever space that moment needed. "It's done," Cole said. She looked at the document for another second. Then she folded it carefully along its existing creases and put it back in the satchel and closed the clasp again. "We should get back," she said. "Claire's alone." "Claire's fine," Cole said. "I know she's fine." A pause. "I want to go home." He went to get the wagon. James walked beside him and said nothing for a few steps, and then said quietly, "She's going to be all right." "She was always going to be all right," Cole said. "She just needed the machinery to stop working against her." James looked back at Evelyn, who was standing on the sidewalk outside the bank with her satchel on her arm, watching the street with an expression that was not victory and not peace exactly, but something between them. The particular look of a person who has been fighting something for a long time and has just put the fight down and is adjusting to the weight of their own hands. "Cole," James said, "I'm glad you wrote the letter." "I know," Cole said. He brought the wagon around and Evelyn climbed up and they rode out of Iron Creek, and the morning was bright and cold and the mountains were white to the west, and the road home ran straight and clear before them. The ride home from Iron Creek that March morning was mostly quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that had been earned. Evelyn sat on the wagon seat with her satchel in her lap and her hands folded over it, and Cole drove, and James rode alongside on the horse he'd rented from the livery, and the road ran south through the valley with the mountains white to the west and the creek catching the morning light in the low places. Nobody felt the need to fill it with words, which was its own kind of progress. 3 people who'd been through something together and didn't have to explain it to each other. They were a mile out of town when Evelyn said, without preamble, "He's not done." Cole didn't look at her. "No. The inquiry is still running. He still has his position at the bank, his lawyer's Meridian." She was looking at the road ahead. "We paid the debt. That doesn't fix what he is." "It fixes what he can do to you," James said from horseback, practical as always. "The rest is someone else's problem to prove." "Reeves is still working it," Cole said. "The Pueblo documents haven't gone anywhere. The inquiry hasn't closed." He paused. "It'll take time." "Everything takes time," Evelyn said. "Yes," he said. "It does." She didn't say anything else about it, and Cole understood why. She'd fought that specific fight for as long as she had the energy to fight it, and now the fight had moved into rooms where she wasn't the one holding the argument. And what that required from her was the hardest thing she'd been asked to do through any of it. To put it down and trust that the machinery, which had worked against her for so long, might now work in the right direction without her having to push it every day. That was the part nobody told you about winning. That sometimes after the crisis, the silence felt wrong, like a sound you'd been straining to hear had suddenly stopped, and your ears were still braced for it. It took most of spring. The banking authority inquiry concluded in June. Cole got the news from Reeves in a letter that arrived on a Tuesday, and he read it twice at the kitchen table of his own ranch before writing to Evelyn's. Reeves wrote in his careful, measured way that Arthur Aldrich had been formally found to have engaged in conduct inconsistent with his fiduciary duties as bank director, specifically the steering of foreclosure proceedings to benefit Meridian Land Holdings, in which he held a personal financial interest. The findings had been referred to the district attorney's office. Aldrich had resigned from the First National Bank 3 days before the findings were made public, which was the act of a man who knew what was coming and was trying to get ahead of it. Ted Gruber's connection to Meridian Land Holdings was noted in the inquiry's supplementary findings. No criminal referral had been made, the evidence of his direct involvement was circumstantial, but the notation was public record, and public record had a way of doing its own kind of work in a small valley where people paid attention to each other's business. Cole rode to the Harper Ranch and found Evelyn and Clara in the east pasture, the slope they'd cleared together in March, which was now showing the first real growth of the season, green and soft in the June morning. They'd moved 12 of the cattle up there the week before, and the animals were working their way through the new grass with the focused satisfaction of cattle on good pasture. He dismounted at the pasture fence and held the letter out over the rail. Evelyn came across the grass and took it, and Clara stood a few feet back and watched her mother read. Evelyn read the letter without her expression changing much. She read it all the way through. Then she folded it and held it in both hands and looked at the cattle in the new pasture for a long moment. "Is it enough?" Clara said. "It's enough to end his career," Evelyn said. "Whether it's enough to put him in front of a judge depends on the district attorney." She paused. "But the bank won't take anyone else's ranch on his word. That's done." Clara looked at the cattle, at the new grass, at the fence line that had been scrub brush 6 months ago. "What about the other ones? Drummond and Sutter?" Evelyn looked at her daughter. "Reeves says the inquiry findings open the possibility of civil suits for the families who lost their properties. He's written to both of them." She folded the letter again, smaller. "Whether they get their land back, I don't know. Probably not. But they'll know they were right about what happened to them. Sometimes that's the only justice that's available." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the directness that was simply who she was, "That's not enough." "No," Evelyn said. "It isn't." They stood at the fence in the June morning, the three of them, and the cattle moved through the good grass, and the creek ran clear in the lower pasture, and the valley was green in all directions the way it only got for about 6 weeks in the year. Cole looked at this place that had nearly been taken from the people standing next to him and thought about what Evelyn had said once, that the hardest part of ranching was the patience, the waiting to see what the land gave back. She'd said she wasn't good at that part. He'd been watching her get better at it all spring. He and Evelyn married in September. It was not a large event. They did it in the small civil office off the county courthouse in Pueblo. Reeves had driven the paperwork himself, as a gesture of professional affection that nobody acknowledged out loud, with James and his wife Margaret present, and Clara in the new dress that Margaret had insisted on buying her in a Pueblo dress shop the day before, over Clara's protest that the old dress was perfectly serviceable, which was true, but beside the point. Clara had known it was coming since approximately March, when she'd asked Cole on the porch step if he was going to stay, and he'd said he thought so. She had opinions about it, which she expressed privately to Cole one afternoon in August while they were both working on the tack room, and her opinions were essentially practical. She wanted to know how it would work, who would be at which ranch, whether the two properties would be combined or run separately, what would happen to the cattle lineage records she'd been keeping. Cole answered each question with the same seriousness she'd asked them with. The two properties would operate as one, he said. They'd live at the Harper Ranch, more room, better water access, and it was Evelyn's ground first, which was how it should stay. His own ranch to the south would be used for additional grazing, managed as part of the same operation. The cattle records Clara had been keeping since October would form the foundation of the new combined herd documentation. "So my records matter," Clara said. "Your records are the best we have," he said. "They were always the best we had." She considered this. Then she said, "Robert would have liked you." "My father." She said it plainly, without drama, in the way she said everything that mattered. "He liked people who were straightforward." Cole looked at her. "That's one of the better things anyone said to me," he said. Clara went back to the bridle she was working on. "I know," she said, which was so completely her mother's cadence that Cole had to look at the wall for a second to collect himself. The first winter of their marriage was hard. They'd known it would be. The Valley winters were always hard, and the first year of a combined operation had the specific difficulty of two systems that worked well separately, learning to function as one. There were disagreements. Cole had ways of doing things that were efficient in his operation and frustrating in the context of the Harper Ranch's layout. Evelyn had systems for feed management and cattle rotation that were excellent but required a learning curve for someone who hadn't developed them himself. They argued about the North water supply in November, and about the calving schedule in January, and about the equipment storage in February, and none of the arguments were about anything except what they appeared to be about, which was ranching, and most of them ended the way the first one had, with one of them acknowledging the other had the better point without making a performance of it. They were both too old and too practical for the version of marriage that pretended friction didn't exist. What they had instead was something harder to name, a working partnership that had grown into something warmer without either of them quite agreeing to it in advance, the way strong things tend to grow when they grow in difficult conditions. They didn't fill the house with sentiment. They filled it with work, an occasional difficult honesty, and the particular warmth that comes from two people who have decided to be on the same side of things. Clara turned 14 that February, and 15 the one after, and by the time she was 16, she was managing the cattle records for the entire combined operation with a precision that made the system Cole had run for 11 years look approximate by comparison. She had her own ideas about breeding selection and pasture rotation, some of which were good, and some of which needed refinement, and she argued for them in the family's working discussions with the same directness she'd brought to every conversation since she was 12 years old, sitting on a hay bale at 4 in the morning. James came back in the summer, as Clara had suggested he should. He brought his wife Margaret, who was a practical woman from New Mexico, who had opinions about everything and expressed them freely, and who took to Evelyn within approximately the first 2 hours with the directness of someone recognizing a kindred approach to life. Margaret and Evelyn sat on the Harper porch that first evening, while Cole and James walked the south pasture the way brothers will. And by the time they came back, the two women had covered the cattle operation, Clara's education prospects, the situation in Pueblo with the civil suits from the Drummond and Sutter families, and Margaret's considered views on the best way to winter a herd in high altitude, which she shared without being asked, but which were also genuinely useful. The Drummond family settled their civil case against the First National Bank 2 years after the inquiry. They didn't get their land back. Meridian Land Holdings had already sold the Drummond property to a developer from Denver who had legal title and no obligation to undo a transaction he'd made in good faith. But they got money. Enough to start again somewhere else. Whether that was justice was a question that depended on who you asked, and the honest answer was that it was the best available version of justice, which is usually not the clean kind. Arthur Aldrich was indicted by the district attorney's office in the spring following the inquiry findings. The case took 18 months to come to trial. Cole and Evelyn both gave depositions. Reeves had prepared them carefully, which was useful, but what made the depositions effective was that both of them simply told what had happened, in order, with specificity, because the truth of what Aldrich had done was more damning than any embellishment. He was convicted on 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty. He was fined and removed from banking permanently. He served 8 months in a county facility. Cole thought about this periodically, about whether it was sufficient for what Aldrich had done, for the families he'd displaced, and the lives he'd complicated, and the specific calculated cruelty of what he'd tried to do to Evelyn and Clara. He thought it wasn't sufficient exactly, but insufficient justice was still justice, and he'd lived long enough to know that holding out for the sufficient kind was a way of making sure you got nothing at all. Evelyn's response, when the conviction came in, was to note it in the household journal she'd started keeping, the same leather journal Cole had given Clara for her birthday, the practice having apparently transferred, and then to ask Cole what he thought about moving the cattle to the upper pasture 2 weeks earlier than usual that spring, which was, he thought, the right response. Not because what had happened to Aldrich didn't matter, because the work that still needed doing mattered more. The ranch grew, not quickly. Nothing in ranching happened quickly, and they'd both learned the patience for slow growth through seasons of having no other choice, but steadily. The east pasture that they'd cleared from scrub in that desperate march became their best summer grazing ground within 3 years. The combined herd that had been fragile and depleted in the winter of their partnership became strong and selective, carrying bloodlines that Clara had researched and argued for and documented with a thoroughness that drew the attention of 2 neighboring ranchers who came to ask her advice. In the summer she turned 17, she gave the advice, plainly and accurately the way she did everything. Then she came home and told Cole about it, and Cole told her she should think about writing it down. Not just the records, but the methodology, the breeding logic, the rotation system. There were people in this valley who could benefit from what she'd figured out. Clara looked at him with an expression that was her mother's assessment look, but with more of her own confidence in it now. "You think anyone would read it?" "I think some of them might pay for it," Cole said. She thought about this for several days. Then she started writing, in the leather journal and then in subsequent notebooks, a systematic account of the Harper Maverick cattle operations approach to herd management in the Colorado Lower Valley. It was not a published document, not yet, not for several more years. But it was the beginning of something, and beginnings were what Cole had come to understand mattered more than endings. Endings were just beginnings that had run their course. On a September evening about 4 years after the mortgage was paid, Cole sat on the Harper porch, his porch now, their porch, watching the last of the light go gold off the hills. The cattle were settled in the creek meadow below. The fences that Dutch and Pete had helped rebuild in that first winter ran clean and straight to the horizon. The stock pond that Robert Harper had designed and Cole had unblocked was full and clear. The east pasture showed the green of late-season grass against the brown of the surrounding hills. Evelyn came out and sat beside him, not in the chair to his left or the chair to his right, but in the chair close enough that their arms touched, which was where she sat now when they sat on the porch in the evening. This had happened gradually, without announcement, like most of the real things between them. She had a cup of coffee. She looked at the same hills he was looking at. "Reeves wrote," she said, "the Drummond family used their settlement to buy land in the San Luis Valley. They're ranching again." Cole looked at the hills. "Good." "It's not the same land," she said, "but it's land." "Yes." They were quiet for a moment. The light was going orange now, the way it did in September, and the cottonwoods along the creek were starting to turn, the first yellow showing in the upper branches. "Do you ever think about Wyoming?" she said. She asked it carefully, the way she asked things that she'd been holding for a while. "Sometimes," he said. "Is it better or worse, thinking about it?" He considered the question honestly, the way she always expected him to answer her questions. "It's different than it used to be," he said. "It used to feel like something I couldn't put down. Now it feels like something I carry, that I know how to carry." She was quiet. Then, "Is that because of here?" "Yes," he said, "and because of you." She didn't say anything to that, but the arm that was touching his pressed slightly closer, and she kept her eyes on the hills. And Cole thought about Daniel and about Margaret, his wife from before, and about James, and about an autumn saloon and a woman with $11 and a straight spine, and about what it meant to lose everything, and what it meant to build again, and how those two things were not as separate as you needed to believe they were when you were in the middle of the first one. Clara came out of the house behind them, a notebook under her arm, her hair down from its braid for the evening. She was 19 now, and taller than her mother, and had a quality about her that was entirely her own. Not Cole's steadiness or Evelyn's determination, but something that had developed in the space between them, forged from watching two people figure out how to be good to each other, and to the land under hard conditions. She sat on the porch railing and opened the notebook. "I need you to look at the spring calving projections," she said. "I want to know if you agree with my numbers before I finalize them." "Hello to you too," Cole said. "Hello?" She didn't look up. "The numbers, please." Evelyn reached over and took the notebook out of Clara's hand. Clara looked up, ready to object. Evelyn held the notebook slightly away and looked at her daughter in the orange evening light. "In a minute," Evelyn said. "Let me look at the hills for one more minute." Clara opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the hills. A 19-year-old with a notebook and projections to finalize, who had grown up on a failing ranch and nearly lost it, and watched two people rebuild it through sheer obstinate work, who had kept the records when no one else remembered to keep them, who knew every animal on the property by name and number and breeding history. She sat on the railing and looked at the hills. One more minute. The three of them on the porch in the September light, the ranch below them quiet and solid and real, built from something that had almost been nothing, held together by the stubbornness of people who had decided, in a saloon, in a barn, at a kitchen table, on a porch step, to stay. The light went. The first stars came out above the eastern ridge. Somewhere down in the creek meadow, the cattle settled. Then Clara said, "All right, the numbers?" And Evelyn handed back the notebook, and Cole leaned over to look, and they worked through the projections there on the porch in the last of the evening, the way they'd worked through everything, together, and not without argument, and not without getting some of it wrong, but together. That was how it had started. One decision in a room full of people who expected the worst. One offer made without a clear plan. One woman who didn't fold when the room told her she should. The land remembered all of it, the way land does. Not in stories, but in the way the grass grew back thicker after the hard years, in the straight lines of the fences, in the cattle that were stronger than they'd been before everything nearly ended. The debt was paid. The banker was gone. The family that had been built from necessity had become something that would outlast all of it. It wasn't a story that resolved the way stories are supposed to resolve. Arthur Aldrich got 8 months. The Drummond family got different land. The Sutter family got a settlement and a long bitterness that money didn't fix. The valley didn't become just or safe because one ranch survived. The machinery that produced men like Aldrich was still running, would keep running, would produce someone else eventually, who would look at someone else's land and decide it was theirs to take. But the Harper Ranch stood. That was something. That was on most days enough. And on the porch, in the dark now, with the notebook passed back and forth, and the projections argued over and the coffee going cold the way coffee always did, there was this. A woman who had walked into a room at her lowest point and refused to look at the floor. A man who had stood up for reasons he hadn't fully understood yet. A girl who had kept the record so nobody could say the work hadn't been done. 3 people who had decided that the hardest kind of courage isn't the dramatic kind. It isn't the single moment, the standoff, the climactic gesture. It's the kind that shows up the next morning and the morning after that and every cold, dark morning after that and just keeps working. That kind of courage doesn't make a great story in the telling, but it makes something better than a story. It makes a life.